They say every great man has a woman behind him. But what happens when that woman decides to walk away and takes his entire empire with her? Tonight, I'm going to tell you about Lillian Voss, a duchess who spent 5 years building her husband into a legend while the world called her nothing. The night she discovered his plan to lock her away forever, she didn't scream. She didn't cry. She did something far more dangerous. She started planning. This is the story of the invisible architect who brought a kingdom to its knees. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The first snow of winter came early to Blackridge that year, dusting the battlements in white that would soon turn gray with soot and ash. Lillian Voss stood at her chamber window, watching flakes drift past the leaded glass, her reflection ghostly in the dim afternoon light. She'd been standing there for nearly an hour, though she couldn't have said why. Habit, maybe. Or the simple fact that there was nowhere else she particularly wanted to be. Below, in the courtyard, servants scurried between the stables and the kitchens, preparing for the evening's banquet. Another celebration. Another excuse for Rowan to accept praise he hadn't earned while she smiled from the shadows and said nothing at all. 5 years. 5 years of this life, and she still felt like a guest in her own home. "My lady?" Lillian turned to find Clara in the doorway, her lady's maid holding a dark green gown across her arms. The girl looked uncertain, as she always did. Lillian had never quite figured out if Clara was afraid of her or simply bewildered by her. Most people were one or the other. "They're asking which dress you'll wear tonight," Clara said, stepping into the room with the tentative movements of someone approaching a sleeping dog. "The Duke sent word that the Marcher Lords will be in attendance. He suggested—" "The green is fine," Lillian said, cutting her off. She didn't need to hear what Rowan had suggested. He always suggested the same thing, something understated, forgettable, a dress that would let her fade into the wallpaper while he held court. Clara laid the gown across the bed and hesitated. "Will you need help dressing, my lady?" "Not yet. Give me an hour." The maid curtsied and disappeared, closing the door with a soft click. Alone again, Lillian returned to the window. The snow was falling harder now, thick enough to blur the edges of the world beyond the glass. Somewhere out there, beyond the walls of Blackridge, beyond the frozen rivers and bare forests of the duchy, there was a war happening. Or at least there had been. News traveled slowly in winter, and slower still when it had to pass through Rowan's careful filters before reaching her. Not that she needed his reports to know what was happening. She'd written half the damn orders herself. The thought made her mouth twist, something between a smile and a grimace. No one knew, of course. That was the arrangement. The bargain she'd made 5 years ago when she'd married Rowan Hale, youngest son of a minor house, a man with more ambition than sense, and a reputation built on battlefield recklessness that people mistook for courage. She'd been 17. He'd been 23 and handsome in that obvious, uncomplicated way that made people want to follow him. Her father had arranged the match, a political alliance to secure the border duchy, a marriage of strategic necessity. Lillian had accepted it the way she accepted everything in those days, with quiet resignation and the faint hope that perhaps this new life would be different from the one she was leaving behind. It hadn't been. Oh, the circumstances had changed. She'd traded her father's cold indifference for Rowan's cheerful neglect. She'd traded a house where she was invisible for a manor where she was ornamental. But the fundamental truth remained the same. Lillian Voss had never mattered to anyone except as a tool to be used. At least now she was useful. The door opened again without warning. Lillian didn't turn around. She recognized the footsteps. Heavy, confident, the boots of a man who'd never learned to knock. "There you are," Rowan said, his voice carrying that particular tone of vague surprise he always used when he found her in her own chambers, as if he'd expected her to be somewhere else entirely. "I've been looking for you." "I've been here," Lillian said to the window. "Where I always am." "Right. Well." He crossed the room, and she caught his reflection in the glass as he came to stand beside her, not quite close enough to touch. He was still in his riding clothes, mud-splattered and smelling of horse and leather. "I wanted to talk to you about tonight. The banquet." "Yes, the Marcher Lords are coming, and Lord Garrett's bringing his whole family. There's going to be, well, it's going to be political, you understand." Lillian almost laughed. Political. As if anything Rowan did wasn't political. as if every smile he flashed and every hand he shook wasn't part of some elaborate performance designed to keep him exactly where he was. Admired, celebrated, untouchable. "I understand," she said. "Good. That's good." He shifted his weight, uncomfortable. He was always uncomfortable around her when they were alone, as if he couldn't quite remember who she was supposed to be to him. "I need you to stay close tonight. To me, I mean. It's important that we present a united front." "Of course. And maybe—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Maybe try to engage a bit more. With the guests, I mean. You have a tendency to fade. People notice." There it was. The criticism wrapped in concern, the implication that her failures were somehow letting him down. Lillian had heard variations of this speech before. She'd learned to accept them with the same bland smile she used for everything else. "I'll do my best," she said. Rowan nodded, already moving toward the door. "Excellent. I knew I could count on you. Oh, and Lillian." He paused in the doorway, glancing back. "Wear something with color, would you? The green makes you look ill." He was gone before she could respond, the door swinging shut behind him with enough force to make the latch rattle. Lillian stared at the dark wood, counting her breaths. 1, 2, 3. When she reached 10, the tightness in her chest had loosened enough for her to move. She turned back to the bed and looked at the green dress. It was a beautiful gown, actually, velvet with delicate gold threading at the cuffs and collar. Claire had spent hours pressing it, but Rowan was right about one thing: it would make her disappear. That was rather the point. Lillian had learned early in her marriage that visibility was dangerous. The more people noticed her, the more questions they asked. And questions led to curiosity, and curiosity led to discoveries she couldn't afford anyone to make. Better to be boring, better to be forgettable, better to be nothing at all. The banquet hall glittered like something out of a fever dream, all candlelight and polished silver, and the kind of forced gaiety that only came from mixing wine, politics, and people who secretly hated each other. Lillian stood near the far wall, a glass of untouched wine in her hand, watching the performance unfold. Rowan was in his element, of course. He stood at the center of a cluster of marcher lords, his voice carrying across the room as he recounted some battle or another. The details didn't matter. They were always the same. A desperate situation, impossible odds, and Rowan's brilliant tactical mind pulling victory from the jaws of defeat. The lords ate it up, nodding and laughing in all the right places, their faces flushed with drink and the vicarious thrill of violence they'd never personally experienced. "Remarkable man, your husband." Lillian didn't jump, but it was close. She turned to find Lord Garrett at her elbow, his expression friendly in that calculating way of career diplomats. He was older than most of the men in the room, with silver threading through his dark beard, and the kind of sharp eyes that didn't miss much. "He has his moments," Lillian said carefully. Modest, as always. Garrett sipped his wine, studying her over the rim of his glass. "I've always admired that about you, Lady Voss. In a court full of peacocks, you're refreshingly understated." It wasn't a compliment. Lillian had been managing men like Garrett long enough to recognize a probe when she heard one. He was testing her, trying to figure out if she was genuinely as dull as she appeared, or if there was something more interesting hiding beneath the surface. "I leave the peacocking to those better suited for it," she said with a thin smile. Garrett laughed, a short bark of genuine amusement. "Well said, though I must confess, I've often wondered about you, my lady. Your husband's rise has been meteoric, almost unprecedented. One doesn't typically see that kind of strategic brilliance emerge fully formed." Lillian's fingers tightened on her wineglass. "Are you suggesting something, Lord Garrett?" "Not at all, not at all." He waved a hand dismissively. "Merely making conversation. Though I suppose, well, you did study at the Athenaeum before your marriage, didn't you? Mathematics and history, if I recall correctly." "Languages," Lillian corrected without thinking, "and strategic studies." "Ah, yes. Strategic studies." Garrett's smile widened slightly. How fortunate for the Duke to have a wife with such complementary interests. The danger in the moment was sharp enough to taste. Lillian felt the familiar calculation running through her mind. Possible responses, probable outcomes, the narrow path between giving too much away and raising more suspicion by refusing to engage. She'd walked this tightrope 100 times before, but it never got easier. Fortunate indeed, she said, keeping her voice light. Though I'm afraid my studies proved largely academic, marriage has a way of redirecting one's priorities. Of course, of course. Garrett was still watching her with those two clever eyes. Still, one can't help but wonder, Father! A young woman appeared at Garrett's side, threading her arm through his with the easy familiarity of family. She was pretty in a conventional way, with carefully arranged curls and a dress cut just low enough to be interesting without crossing into scandalous. You promised to introduce me to Duke Hale. Ah, yes. Garrett's attention shifted, and Lillian felt the pressure of his scrutiny lift like a weight removed from her shoulders. Lady Voss, may I present my daughter, Catherine? Catherine, this is the Duchess of Blackridge. The girl curtsied prettily, her eyes sliding past Lillian without interest. A pleasure, my lady, though I really must steal my father away. The Duke has promised to tell us about the siege of Thornhaven, and I've been dying to hear it. By all means, Lillian said, stepping back to let them pass. She watched as Garrett and his daughter made their way toward Rowan's circle, Catherine's laugh carrying back across the room, bright and musical and perfectly calculated to draw attention. For a moment, Lillian felt something twist in her chest. Not jealousy exactly, she'd long since stopped caring who Rowan charmed or flirted with. But there was something in the easy way Catherine commanded space, the assumption that she deserved to be noticed and heard, that made Lillian acutely aware of her own careful invisibility. She'd chosen this. That was the worst part. She'd made herself small on purpose, had filed away every sharp edge and interesting angle until there was nothing left that might catch the light. And now, years later, she'd done the job so well that even she sometimes forgot there had ever been anything more to file away. You look like you're at a funeral. Lillian turned to find Marcus Thorne leaning against the wall beside her, a glass of whiskey in his hand and an expression of amused sympathy on his weathered face. Marcus was Rowan's master of arms, a grizzled veteran who'd served the Hale family since before Lillian had been born. He was one of the few people in Blackridge who ever spoke to her like a person instead of a decorative fixture. Just watching, she said. Dangerous habit, that. He took a drink, his gaze following hers to where Rowan was now demonstrating some sword technique to an attentive audience. Though I suppose someone ought to keep an eye on things. Lord knows our glorious Duke gets lost in his own legend when he's had a few drinks. It was the kind of comment that could get a man dismissed if the wrong person overheard it. Lillian glanced around, but no one was paying them any attention. They never did. He earned his legend, she said quietly. It was the party line, the thing she was supposed to say, even to Marcus. Sure he did. Marcus's tone was dry enough to start fires. Just like I'm secretly the king of Valdoria, we all have our little fictions, don't we, my lady? Lillian looked at him sharply, but his expression remained neutral, giving nothing away. Marcus had always been perceptive. It was part of what made him good at his job. But she'd never been certain exactly how much he'd piece together or what he'd do with the information if he ever confirmed his suspicions. I should circulate, she said, setting her untouched wine on a passing servant's tray. Rowan wanted me to engage with the guests. Right. Wouldn't want to disappoint the Duke. Marcus pushed off from the wall, straightening his jacket. Word of advice, though. That Garrett fellow has been asking questions about supply lines and troop movements, the kind of questions that suggest he's already got some answers and he's just testing to see if the stories match. Lillian's stomach went cold. What kind of questions? The dangerous kind. Marcus met her eyes, and for a moment she saw something there that might have been concern or warning. Just be careful, my lady. Not everyone here is as drunk as they're pretending to be. He walked away before she could respond, disappearing into the crowd with the ease of a man who'd spent his life learning to be unremarkable when it suited him. Lillian stood very still, her mind already racing through the implications. Lord Garrett was suspicious. That much was clear. The question was what he suspected and how much proof he had. If he'd been digging into supply records, comparing them with battle reports, looking for inconsistencies. The music swelled, and someone called for dancing. Rowan appeared at the edge of the crowd, Catherine Garrett on his arm, leading her toward the center of the floor. He was smiling, that easy, charming smile that made people want to give him things. Catherine was smiling too, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her dress swirling as they took their positions. Lillian watched them begin to dance, watched the way the candlelight caught the gold threading in Catherine's gown, the way Rowan's hand settled at her waist with comfortable familiarity. They looked good together. natural, like the hero and heroine of some romantic tale. The kind of tale where the overlooked wife was just a footnote, if she appeared at all. "My lady?" Clara materialized at her side, looking worried. "Are you well? You've gone quite pale." "I'm fine," Lillian said automatically. "Just tired. I think I'll retire early." "But the Duke said—" "I don't care what the Duke said." The words came out sharper than she'd intended, sharp enough to make Clara flinch. Lillian forced herself to soften her tone. "I'm sorry, I have a headache. Please make my excuses." She didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked toward the side door, the one that led to the servants' corridors, the routes that would get her back to her chambers without having to navigate the main halls. No one tried to stop her. No one even seemed to notice she was leaving. Story of her life, really. The servants' corridors were dim and narrow, lit by infrequent torches that threw dancing shadows on the stone walls. Lillian had discovered these passages in her first month at Blackridge, during one of many sleepless nights when she'd wandered the manor looking for somewhere to feel less trapped. They connected every major room in the keep, designed so that servants could move through the building without disturbing their betters. These days, Lillian probably used them more than the servants did. She was halfway to her chambers when she heard voices ahead. Male voices, low and intense, coming from somewhere around the next corner. Lillian slowed, her instincts prickling with warning. The servants knew better than to linger in these corridors. They moved through them quickly and quietly, always aware that walls had ears, which meant these weren't servants. Lillian pressed herself against the wall, barely breathing, and listened. "Don't see what you're so worried about." That was Rowan's voice, slightly slurred with drink, but recognizable. "No one suspects anything. Lord Garrett suspects." A woman's voice, cultured and precise. Lillian didn't recognize it immediately. "He's been asking questions, Rowan. Pointed questions." "Garrett's always asking questions. The man's paranoid. The man is careful. There's a difference." A pause. And then the woman continued, her tone sharpening. "We can't afford for him to start connecting dots. Not when we're this close." "Close to what?" Rowan sounded petulant now, like a child being scolded. "We've already won. The war is over, the duchy is secure, and I'm the bloody hero of Blackridge. What more do you want?" "I want us to stop being vulnerable." The woman's voice dropped lower, intimate in a way that made Lillian's skin crawl. "As long as she's here, we're exposed. She knows too much." Silence. Then Rowan, sounding uncertain. "Lillian doesn't know anything." "Rowan." The woman laughed, a sound like broken glass. "Your wife isn't stupid. Invisible, yes. Boring, absolutely. But not stupid. She's been managing your correspondence, your reports, your entire strategic apparatus for 5 years. Do you really think she hasn't figured out that you couldn't find your own ass with both hands and a map?" "That's not—" Rowan's voice rose, defensive. "I'm a capable commander. Everyone says so. Everyone says so because I taught you what to say and she wrote the plans to back it up." The woman's patience was clearly wearing thin, but that stops being an asset the moment she decides to tell someone the truth. Or worse, the moment someone like Garrett figures it out and decides to ask her directly. Lillian's heart was pounding so hard she was sure they must be able to hear it through the stone. She recognized the woman's voice now. Isadora Crane, Rowan's military advisor, a sharp-eyed strategist from the capital who'd arrived in Blackridge 3 years ago and somehow never left. Lillian had always assumed there was something between them, but she'd been too grateful for another mind in the manor to care much about the nature of their relationship. Now she was realizing exactly how stupid that assumption had been. "So what are you suggesting?" Rowan asked. He sounded tired, like they'd had this conversation before. "I'm suggesting we remove the problem." Isadora's voice was calm, almost gentle. "Permanently." The word hung in the air like smoke. Lillian forgot to breathe. "You want me to, what? Divorce her? Her father would never allow it, and the political fallout—" "Not divorce." Isadora cut him off. "Though I suppose that would be kinder. No, I'm thinking something more medical, a tragic decline. Perhaps a few months of carefully managed instability, witnessed by the right people. And then, regrettably, the Duke has no choice but to have his poor, fragile wife move somewhere she can receive proper care. You're talking about locking her up. I'm talking about protecting everything we've built. Isidore's voice hardened. She's a liability, Rowan. As long as she's free to talk, to think, to potentially grow a spine and decide she deserves credit for her own work, she's a threat to both of us. To everything we've accomplished together. Lillian pressed her hand over her mouth, fighting down the urge to vomit. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. She won't talk, Rowan said, but he sounded uncertain. She's never said anything in 5 years. Why would she start now? Because eventually everyone breaks. Isidore's footsteps moved closer to the corner where Lillian was hidden. And I'm not willing to bet our future on the hope that your overlooked little wife will stay overlooked forever. Are you? Silence stretched out, long enough that Lillian started to hope. Maybe Rowan would say no. Maybe somewhere in his self-centered, glory-addicted mind, there was still enough decency to refuse this. Maybe... How long would it take? Rowan asked quietly. And just like that, the last fragile hope Lillian had been holding on to shattered into dust. A few weeks to establish the pattern, Isidore said. She sounded pleased, like a teacher whose slow student had finally grasped a difficult concept. We start small, forgotten conversations, misplaced items, little moments of confusion that make people start to worry. Then we escalate. Maybe a scene at dinner, a night where she wanders the halls, confused and disoriented. By the time we're done, everyone from the servants to the marcher lords will agree that the poor Duchess has lost her grip on reality. And then? And then you do the difficult but necessary thing. You have her moved to a sanitarium, somewhere quiet and remote, where she can live out her days in comfort, well cared for but safely away from the pressures of court life that have so obviously overwhelmed her fragile mind. Rowan made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been discomfort. Lillian couldn't tell and found she didn't much care. The details didn't matter. The fundamental truth was clear enough. Her husband and his lover were planning to have her declared insane and locked away forever. And she had absolutely no one she could tell who would believe her over them. We should get back, Isidore said. People will notice if we're both gone too long. You go first. I'll follow in a few minutes. Footsteps. Moving away. Lillian waited until she was sure they were gone before she let herself slide down the wall to sit on the cold stone floor. Her legs had stopped working somewhere during the conversation, along with most of her higher brain functions. Lock her away. Make her disappear. Erase her like a mistake in a ledger. The worst part was how little surprise she felt. Rowan had never loved her. She'd known that from the start. Their marriage had been a transaction, nothing more. But she'd thought, in some stupid, naive corner of her mind, that her usefulness might at least buy her basic safety, that as long as she was valuable, she'd be protected. She'd been wrong. Lillian sat in the dark corridor for a long time, her mind carefully blank. Then, slowly, something began to shift. Not panic, not despair. Something colder and clear, like ice forming over deep water. They wanted her gone. Fine. She could be gone, but she'd be damned if she was going quietly. Lillian pushed herself to her feet, her legs steady again, her hands no longer shaking. She'd spent 5 years building Rowan into a legend, 5 years weaving the invisible architecture that held this duchy together. She knew every secret, every vulnerability, every carefully constructed lie that formed the foundation of his power. And if she was going down, she was taking all of it with her. The question was how. Lillian's chambers were exactly as she'd left them, cold, orderly, and impersonal as a museum display. She'd never bothered to make them feel like home. What was the point? This had never been her home. Just another place where she was expected to be small and quiet and grateful for the privilege of being ignored. She lit the lamps and stood in the center of the room, looking at the space with new eyes. What did she have? What tools were available to her? Not much at first glance. Her clothes, her books, a handful of personal items. Nothing that screamed arsenal for taking down a duke. But Lillian hadn't spent 5 years managing intelligence networks without learning how to work with limited resources. She crossed to her writing desk and pulled open the locked bottom drawer. The key hung on a chain around her neck, never removed, even when she slept. Inside the drawer was a leather portfolio containing something far more valuable than jewels or gold, copies of every coded message, every strategic plan, every piece of correspondence she'd ever written in Rowan's name. She'd started keeping them almost by accident in the early days of her marriage, a way to track what she'd already sent, to make sure she didn't contradict herself. But as the years passed and Rowan's reputation grew, the collection had taken on a different significance. Proof, evidence, a record of exactly who had built this glittering facade and who had simply stood in front of it, accepting applause. Lillian spread the documents across her desk, her mind already sorting through them. Battle plans, supply orders, intelligence reports from agents Rowan didn't even know existed. Everything was written in cipher, of course, a complex system she'd designed herself, layers upon layers of substitution and transposition that would take even a skilled cryptographer months to crack. Without the key, these documents were useless. With it, they were dynamite. The master cipher ledger was kept in Rowan's study, locked in the same safe where he stored his official correspondence and the duchy's seal. Lillian had watched him open it 100 times, had memorized the combination without really meaning to. She could get to it. The question was whether she could get it out. A knock at the door made her jump. She swept the documents back into the drawer and locked it, her heart racing. "My lady?" Clara's voice muffled through the heavy wood. "I've brought you some tea for your headache." Lillian opened the door to find her maid standing in the hallway with a tray, looking worried and a bit frightened. The girl had probably been sent to check on her, to make sure she wasn't doing anything the Duke wouldn't approve of. "Thank you, Clara," Lillian said, taking the tray. "You can go. I won't need anything else tonight." "Are you certain, my lady? You still look quite pale. Perhaps I should—" "I'm fine." Lillian softened her tone with an effort. "Just tired. I'll see you in the morning." Clara curtsied and left, still looking uncertain. Lillian closed the door and set the tea aside untouched. She couldn't afford to be sleepy or slow, not tonight. She returned to her desk and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. Then she began to write, her hand steady, her mind clear for the first time in years. She didn't write in cipher this time. She wrote in plain language, direct and brutal and true. A letter to Lord Garrett, laying out exactly who had been running Blackridge's military operations for the past 5 years. Names, dates, specific battles where Rowan's brilliant strategies had actually been her carefully crafted plans. She included details that only the architect of those plans could know. The reasoning behind troop deployments, the intelligence that had driven key decisions, the contingency plans that had never needed to be activated because the primary strategies had worked so well. It was a confession, a detonation. The kind of letter that would destroy Rowan's reputation completely if it ever saw the light of day. Lillian sealed it, addressed it, and tucked it into her bodice. Insurance, she told herself. Something to buy her life if it came down to that. But even as she thought it, she knew she was lying to herself. This wasn't insurance. This was a declaration of war. The next morning dawned gray and cold, the kind of winter day where the sun never quite managed to burn through the clouds. Lillian woke early, despite having barely slept. She'd spent most of the night sitting at her window, watching the snow fall and thinking through scenarios, probabilities, risks. By the time Clara arrived to help her dress, she'd made her decision. "The blue today," Lillian said, pointing to a traveling dress at the back of her wardrobe. It was practical, warm, with sensible closures she could manage without help. "And my riding boots." Clara blinked. "My lady? Are you going somewhere?" "Just for a ride," Lillian lied smoothly. "I need some air. The headache is lingering." It was a thin excuse. Lillian rarely rode, and never alone, but Clara accepted it with the trained-in curiosity of a servant who'd learned not to question her betters. She helped Lillian into the dress, laced the boots, and pinned her hair into a simple style that wouldn't come undone in the wind. When she was gone, Lillian stood in front of her mirror and studied her reflection. She looked like herself, pale, serious, forgettable. Good. She needed to be forgettable for a little while longer. She tucked the letter to Garrett deeper into her bodice, added a small purse of coins from her personal allowance, and wrapped herself in a heavy cloak. Then she made her way down through the manor, using the servants' corridors again, avoiding any route where she might encounter Rowan or Isadora or anyone else who might question where she was going. The stables were quiet at this hour, most of the grooms still at breakfast. Lillian saddled her own horse, a placid gray mare that had been chosen for her specifically because it was unlikely to do anything interesting or dangerous. She'd never been grateful for that deliberate mediocrity before, but today she was. A horse that wouldn't draw attention was exactly what she needed. She led the mare out through the side gate, the one used by servants and delivery wagons, where the guards barely glanced at her. Just the Duchess, taking an early morning ride. Nothing unusual, nothing worth noting. Lillian waited until she was out of sight of the walls before she let herself acknowledge what she was doing. She was running, not fleeing in panic, not scrambling blindly away from danger. This was different. This was strategic, calculated. She was removing herself from the board before Rowan and Isadora could make their move, taking her time and her knowledge and her dangerous, documented truth somewhere they couldn't reach her. The question was where? Lord Garrett was the obvious choice. He'd been asking questions, which meant he was already suspicious. The letter in her bodice would give him enough ammunition to ruin Rowan completely, but it would also ruin her. Once word got out that a duchess had been running her husband's military campaigns in secret, Lillian would become infamous, a curiosity, a scandal. She'd never be able to disappear back into obscurity, and obscurity had always been her only defense. No, Garrett was insurance, not a solution. She needed somewhere farther away, somewhere beyond Rowan's reach, beyond his influence, beyond the borders of this kingdom entirely. The Valdorian Empire. The thought came to her suddenly, clear and complete. Valdoria had been Blackridge's enemy for most of the recent war, but there'd been a treaty signed 6 months ago, fragile, temporary, held together more by exhaustion than actual peace. But it meant the borders were open, at least nominally, and more importantly, it meant Valdoria would be very interested in anything that might give them an advantage over their newly peaceful neighbors. Lillian had something they'd want. She had 5 years of classified intelligence, intimate knowledge of Blackridge's defenses and strategies, and the cipher system that locked all of it together. She had the architectural plans for an entire duchy's security apparatus. And if she played this right, she could trade that knowledge for something she'd never had before: real power. The kind that couldn't be stripped away or locked up or erased. The kind that belonged to her and her alone. Lillian turned her horse north toward the Valdorian border and didn't look back. The border between Blackridge and Valdoria was marked by a river that ran black even in summer, fed by iron-rich springs that stained the rocks and gave the water a metallic taste. In winter, it half froze, creating a treacherous landscape of ice shelves and dark, rushing channels where the current ran too fast to freeze solid. Lillian reached it 3 days after leaving the manor, 3 days of riding through forest roads and sleeping in her cloak beneath trees, rationing the dried meat and bread she'd stolen from the kitchens. Her hands were numb inside her gloves, her face wind-burned and raw, and the mare was limping slightly from a stone she'd picked up that morning. They made a sorry pair, nothing like the polished duchess and her well-groomed mount that had left Blackridge's stables. Good. The more unrecognizable she became, the better. She dismounted at the river's edge and studied the crossing. There was supposed to be a ford here, shallow enough to wade in warmer months, but the ice had changed the terrain completely. What looked like solid ground might be a snow-covered shelf ready to give way. What looked like open water might be frozen solid beneath a dusting of powder. "Well," Lillian said to the mare, who flicked an ear but offered no opinion, "nothing for it." She led the horse forward carefully, testing each step before committing her weight. The ice groaned beneath her boots, but held. Then they were in the water, shockingly cold, even through leather, the current pulling at her legs with insistent fingers. The mare balked, eyes rolling white. "Come on," Lillian urged, pulling at the reins. "Don't quit on me now." The mare took 2 more steps, and then her hoof slipped on submerged ice. She went down hard, taking Lillian with her. The black water closed over Lillian's head, so cold it felt like being stabbed with 1,000 knives at once. She surfaced gasping, her cloak dragging at her shoulders like hands pulling her back down. The current had her, spinning her downstream, away from the mare's thrashing hooves. She'd spent 5 years behind a desk, managing correspondence and writing battle plans. She was a decent rider, but a terrible swimmer, and the weight of her sodden clothes was pulling her under. This was how it ended then, not locked in some sanitarium, but drowned in a freezing river on the border of a foreign empire, her body lost to the current, her secrets dying with her. The thought made her furious. Lillian kicked hard, fighting against the drag of her cloak, and managed to grab hold of an ice shelf. It cracked under her weight, but didn't break completely. She dragged herself up onto it, inch by painful inch, until she was lying flat on her stomach, gasping and shaking so hard her teeth rattled. The mare had made it to the far bank and stood there looking back at her, dripping and miserable but alive. Lillian's bag was still strapped to the saddle. Everything she owned in the world was over there, just out of reach, while she was stuck on a shelf of ice that might give way at any moment. "Fine," she said through chattering teeth. We're doing this. She crawled forward on her belly, distributing her weight, testing each section of ice before trusting it. It took forever, or maybe 10 minutes that felt like forever, but eventually she reached the far bank and hauled herself out onto solid ground. Valdorian ground. For a moment she just lay there, too cold and exhausted to move. Then she forced herself up. Hypothermia would kill her faster than Rowan ever could if she didn't get warm and dry. There were no buildings visible, no signs of civilization at all. Just trees and snow and the Black River behind her. Lillian stripped off her sodden cloak and outer dress with shaking hands, wrung them out as best she could, and pulled them back on. They were still wet, still freezing, but marginally better than before. Then she mounted the mare, a struggle that took 3 attempts, and urged her forward into the trees. She needed shelter, fire, dry clothes, in that order before her body gave out completely. The forest was dense here, pine and bare hardwood mixed together, branches heavy with snow. Lillian let the mare pick her own path, too focused on staying conscious to worry about direction. Her mind kept trying to drift, lured by the dangerous warmth of near hypothermia. She fought it, biting her tongue until she tasted blood, using the pain to stay present. When she saw smoke rising through the trees ahead, she thought she was hallucinating. Then she smelled it, wood smoke and something else, something cooking. Her stomach cramped with sudden, vicious hunger. She should have been cautious, should have circled around, assessed the situation, made sure it was safe before revealing herself. But she was too cold and too tired to be strategic. She just pointed the mare toward the smoke and hoped whoever was on the other end of it wouldn't shoot her on sight. The source turned out to be a hunter's cabin, small and rough but solid, with a stone chimney leaking gray smoke into the winter sky. 2 horses were tied outside, better fed and better equipped than her exhausted mare. As Lillian approached, the door opened and a man stepped out, crossbow already raised and aimed at her chest. "That's far enough," he said in Valdorian. His accent was thick but understandable. Lillian had studied the language at the Athenaeum, though she'd never expected to use it like this. "State your business. Shelter," Lillian said. Her voice came out hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "Please, I need—" Her vision grayed at the edges. The mare stopped walking, and Lillian realized dimly that she'd stopped giving any commands. The man with the crossbow was shouting something, but the words weren't making sense anymore. Then she was falling, and the ground was rushing up to meet her, and everything went dark. She woke up warm. It was such a shock after days of unrelenting cold that for a moment she just lay there, cataloging the sensation. Wool blankets, heavy and rough. A fire crackling nearby. Her clothes were gone, replaced by a shirt that smelled like wood smoke and someone else's sweat. Her hair was loose and dry. Lillian opened her eyes to find herself on a narrow cot in the corner of the cabin. The man with the crossbow sat by the fire, watching her with the wary expression of someone who'd found a snake in their bedroll and wasn't sure if it was venomous. "You're awake," he said. Not a question. "Where are my clothes?" Lillian's voice was still rough, but functional. "Drying. You were half frozen. Another hour and you'd have been dead." He tilted his head, studying her. "You're Blackridge, yes? Your Valdorian is good, but the accent's wrong. No point lying." "Yes. Long way from home." He didn't move, but his hand rested near a knife on his belt. "We're 2 days inside the border. You planning to tell me what a Blackridge woman is doing crossing the river in winter, or do I need to guess?" Lillian pushed herself up to sitting, keeping the blanket wrapped around her. Her mind was working again, sluggish but functional, sorting through options. She could lie. Make up some story about a family emergency, a dying relative, anything to explain why she'd risk the crossing. But lies required energy to maintain, and she was running on fumes. Besides, she'd come here to trade in truth. Might as well start now. "I'm running from my husband," she said. Simple, direct. He was planning to have me locked away, and I decided to leave before he could. The man's expression didn't change. Lots of places to run that don't involve freezing rivers and foreign empires. I have something he wants back. Something valuable. Lillian met his eyes. "I need to get to your capital, to someone who can use what I'm offering." "And what exactly are you offering?" "Information. Military intelligence from Blackridge's recent campaigns, strategic plans, troop deployments, supply routes, 5 years' worth of classified material." She paused. "And the cipher system that locks all of it." That got a reaction. The man's eyes narrowed and he leaned forward slightly. That's a bold claim for a woman traveling alone with nothing but a half-dead horse. The documents are in code, hidden in my saddlebag, sewn into the lining. Lillian gestured toward where her bag sat by the door. Check if you don't believe me. He studied her for a long moment, then stood and crossed to the bag. He pulled out her few belongings, spare shift, the coins, a comb, and felt along the lining until he found the hidden pocket. The documents came out in a waterproof oilcloth package, still intact despite her swim in the river. The man unfolded one of the pages and frowned at it. This is gibberish. It's cipher. Like I said, Lillian kept her voice steady. I'm the only person who can decode it. That's why I'm valuable. Or you're a spy, sent by your people to feed us false information. He set the document down but didn't return it. Give me one reason I shouldn't turn you over to the border guards and let them sort you out. Because if I'm telling the truth, you'll have just handed your superiors the intelligence coup of the decade, Lillian said. And if I'm lying, they'll figure it out soon enough and you can execute me then. Either way, you win. It was a calculated risk pushing him like this. But she'd spent 5 years reading men like him, soldiers who valued efficiency over sentiment, who made decisions based on potential gain versus cost. He'd already saved her life once. That suggested he saw some value in keeping her alive. The man was quiet for a long time, his gaze moving between Lillian and the coded documents. Finally, he sighed. My name is Dmitri. I'm a scout for the Empire's northern forces. My partner, he gestured toward a second cot where someone was sleeping, covered in blankets, is Vera. We were on patrol when you showed up half dead on our doorstep. Lillian, she said. Lillian Voss. Though I'd prefer if that name didn't travel too far too fast. I'm sure you would. Dmitri crossed his arms. Here's what's going to happen. We'll take you to the regional commander when our patrol ends in 2 days. You can make your pitch to her. If she believes you, she'll send you up the chain. If she doesn't, she'll probably have you shot as a spy. Fair? It wasn't fair at all, but Lillian didn't have much room to negotiate. Fair enough. Good. Now get some rest. You look like death warmed over. He returned to his spot by the fire, but she noticed he kept the documents close at hand. Lillian lay back down, pulling the blankets up to her chin. Her body was warm, but the rest of her felt hollowed out, scraped clean of everything except a kind of numb determination. She'd made it across the border. She was alive. That was more than she'd had any right to expect when she'd ridden away from Blackridge 3 days ago. Now came the hard part. Convincing the Valdorian Empire that an overlooked duchess from an enemy duchy was worth keeping alive. The next 2 days passed in a strange, suspended routine. Dmitri and Vera, who turned out to be a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with a scar across her jaw and a dry sense of humor, treated Lillian with the cautious courtesy usually reserved for unexploded ordnance. They fed her from their supplies, let her warm herself by their fire, and didn't ask too many questions beyond the basics. In return, Lillian kept quiet and tried to make herself useful. She tended the horses, helped with cooking, and demonstrated enough basic competence that they stopped watching her quite so closely. She could have run, probably, stolen one of their horses and disappeared deeper into Valdorian territory. But where would she go? She had no contacts here, no resources, no plan beyond reaching someone with enough authority to understand what she was offering. So she stayed and waited, and tried not to think about what was happening back in Blackridge. Rowan would have noticed her absence by now, would have searched her chambers, found the missing documents, realized what she'd taken. She could imagine his rage, his panic, the way he'd turned the manor upside down looking for her. Would Isidore have told him to send riders after her? Or would they try to keep it quiet, pretend she'd simply taken ill and was resting in her chambers, buying time to figure out how to explain her disappearance without raising questions? Either way, there was no going back. She'd crossed more than just a river when she'd left. She'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. On the morning of the 3rd day, Dmitri led them out of the forest and onto a proper road. They rode for several hours, passing through 2 small villages where people stared at Lillian with open curiosity. By midday, they reached a fortified outpost, nothing like Blackridge's imposing walls, but solid enough, with real soldiers on the battlements and the Empire's banner flying overhead. Wait here, Dmitri said, dismounting in the courtyard. I'll find Commander Petrov. He disappeared into the main building, leaving Lillian with Vera, who lit a pipe and smoked in companionable silence. Lillian's stomach was in knots, but she kept her face calm. She'd learned that skill early in life, the ability to look serene even when everything inside was churning. When Dmitri returned, he had a woman with him. Commander Petrov was younger than Lillian had expected, maybe 35, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and the kind of face that gave nothing away. She looked Lillian up and down with the assessing gaze of someone who bought horses and didn't want to be cheated. "You're the Blackridge defector," Petrov said in perfect, unaccented Valdorian. "I prefer to think of myself as a strategic asset," Lillian replied. "But yes," something that might have been amusement flickered across Petrov's face. "Dmitri says you're carrying classified intelligence, that you're the only one who can decode it. That's correct? Prove it." Lillian had expected this. She took the documents from Dmitri and selected one at random, a supply manifest from a campaign 18 months ago. "Do you have paper? A pen?" Petrov gestured, and a young soldier hurried to provide them. Lillian sat down at a rough wooden table and began to work. The cipher was complex, designed to resist casual decryption, but she'd created it. She knew every layer, every substitution, every trap built in to catch someone trying to break it through pattern recognition. It took 20 minutes to decode the first paragraph. When she finished, she slid the paper across to Petrov. The commander read it, her expression unchanging. Then she read it again, more slowly. "This is a supply manifest for the Thornhaven campaign. Yes, showing delivery dates, quantities, and routes for ammunition and medical supplies." Lillian kept her voice level. "The dates match up with the official records from that campaign. You can verify them if you want." "We will." Petrov set the paper down. "If this is genuine, and that's still a significant if, it's valuable. But it's also historical. The war is over. These documents might be interesting to military historians, but they're not actionable intelligence." Lillian had prepared for this too. The cipher system isn't historical. It's still in use for all of Blackridge's classified communications. Every order, every intelligence report, every piece of sensitive correspondence passes through it. With the key, you can read everything they send, and more importantly, you can send false orders that will be accepted as genuine. That landed. Petrov's eyes sharpened, and she leaned forward slightly. "You're suggesting we could intercept and manipulate their entire command structure?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you what's possible." Lillian met her gaze. "The question is what that's worth to you." Petrov was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood. "Wait here. Don't leave the outpost, don't speak to anyone, don't do anything stupid. I need to send messages, get authorization. This is above my authority level." "How long will that take?" "Days. Maybe a week." Petrov headed for the door, then paused. "Dmitri. Vera. You're responsible for her. If she runs, it's on you." "Understood, Commander," Dmitri said. When Petrov was gone, Vera chuckled. "Well, you've certainly made an impression." "Is that good or bad?" Lillian asked. "With Petrov?" "Hard to say. She's not one for showing her hand." Vera knocked ash from her pipe. "But I'll tell you this much. She didn't have you arrested on the spot. That's something. It would have to be enough." The week that followed was one of the strangest of Lillian's life. She was given a small room in the officers' quarters, plain but warm, with a real bed and clean clothes that almost fit. Dmitri and Vera took turns watching her, though they were relaxed about it. Less guards than babysitters, making sure she didn't wander into trouble. She spent her days walking the outpost courtyard, watching the soldiers train, thinking about what came next. At night, she decoded more documents, building up a portfolio of verified intelligence to strengthen her case. Each page she translated felt like cutting another tie to her old life. These weren't just military records. They were proof of every hour she'd spent hunched over her desk, every late night decoding reports while Rowan slept, every strategic decision she'd made and watched him take credit for. It should have hurt more, giving it all away to a foreign power. But mostly, Lillian just felt relieved. Let someone else carry the weight of it. Let someone else decide what to do with 5 years of invisible work. On the 8th day, Commander Petrov returned with orders. "You're going to the capital. There are people there who want to meet you." "What kind of people?" Lillian asked. "The kind who decide whether you're an asset or a liability." Petrov's expression was unreadable. "Pack your things. We leave in an hour." The journey to the capital took 5 days. traveling with a military escort that made the whole thing feel somewhere between a parade and an arrest. They stayed in garrison towns along the way, where Lillian was given decent quarters and better food than she'd eaten in months. The Valdorian countryside was different from Black Ridge, flatter, more open, with villages clustered around crossroads instead of hiding in valleys. The people looked different too, though she couldn't quite put her finger on how. On the final day, they crested a hill, and Lillian got her first view of Valdor, the Empire's capital. It sprawled across both banks of a wide river, all white stone and red tile roofs, with a massive fortress palace dominating the skyline. It was easily 3 times the size of Black Ridge's largest city, and the roads leading to it were crowded with wagons and travelers even in winter. "Impressive, isn't it?" Petrov said, riding up beside her. "Hard to believe we're supposed to be the barbarians." "I never thought you were barbarians," Lillian said. "Your husband did. All his intelligence reports referred to us as the savage horde." Petrov's smile was sharp. "I read them. The decoded ones you provided." Lillian felt her face heat. He had certain biases. He had the strategic sophistication of a child playing soldiers. Petrov's tone was matter-of-fact. If we'd been facing an actual military mind instead of a glory-hungry fool with a clever wife, the war would have gone very differently. It was probably the closest thing to a compliment Lillian had received in 5 years. She wasn't quite sure what to do with it. They entered the city through the northern gate, where guards in polished armor checked their papers and waved them through. The streets were cobbled and clean, lined with buildings that ranged from practical to ornate. People stopped to stare as the military column passed, and Lillian kept her hood up, suddenly aware of how foreign she must look. The palace was even more impressive up close, a sprawling complex of buildings and courtyards, all surrounded by walls that made Black Ridge's defenses look like a child's fort. They passed through 3 sets of gates before finally stopping in an inner courtyard where servants waited to take their horses. "This way," Petrov said, leading Lillian into the main building. The interior was warm and richly decorated, with tapestries on the walls and carpets that muffled their footsteps. They climbed stairs, walked down corridors, and finally stopped at a heavy wooden door where 2 guards stood watch. "The Council of Ministers is waiting," Petrov said. "They'll ask you questions. Answer honestly. Don't try to exaggerate your value or hide your limitations. They're very good at detecting lies." "What happens if they don't believe me?" Lillian asked. "Then you'll be executed as a spy, and I'll be reprimanded for wasting their time." Petrov's expression was flat. "So let's hope you're as valuable as you claim." The guards opened the door, and Lillian stepped through into a long room dominated by a table where 7 people sat. 3 men, 4 women, all older than her, all watching with the kind of focused attention that made her skin prickle. At the head of the table sat a woman who had to be in her 60s, white-haired and sharp-eyed, wearing robes that marked her as someone important. "Lady Voss," the woman said, "I am High Minister Katerin. These are my fellow ministers. We've been reading your decoded documents with great interest." "Thank you for seeing me, High Minister," Lillian said. Her voice stayed steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. "Let's dispense with pleasantries," Katerin said. "You claim to have created the cipher system currently used by Black Ridge's military. You claim to have been the architect behind Duke Hale's strategic successes. These are extraordinary claims. They're also true. Perhaps. But we need more than your word." Katerin gestured, and a man at the far end of the table stood. He was younger than the others, with ink-stained fingers and the distracted look of a scholar. "This is Minister Vale, our chief cryptographer. He's reviewed your decoded samples. He has questions." Vale approached, carrying a sheaf of papers. "The cipher system you've demonstrated is sophisticated, multi-layered, resistant to frequency analysis, with built-in traps for amateur code breakers. It's very good work." "Thank you," Lillian said carefully. "Too good, almost, for someone without formal training." Vale's eyes were sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Your husband's military academy would have taught basic cryptography, but this is doctoral-level work. Where did you learn it?" "The Athenaeum. I studied mathematics and strategic theory before my marriage." "Under which professors?" Lillian named them and watched Vale make notes. This was a test, she realized. They were verifying her credentials, making sure she was actually capable of what she claimed. The questions continued for over an hour. They asked about specific battles, about supply routes, about tactical decisions made during the war. They asked technical questions about the cipher, about implementation details that only its creator would know. They asked about Blackridge's defensive positions, its alliances, its internal politics. Lillian answered everything as accurately as she could. She didn't exaggerate or embellish. She admitted when she didn't know something. And slowly, she watched the skepticism in their faces shift to something else. Not quite belief, but consideration. Finally, Katerin raised a hand and the question stopped. Enough. We need to deliberate. She looked at Lillian. You'll be escorted to quarters where you can rest. We'll summon you when we've made our decision. How long will that take? Lillian asked. As long as it takes. Katerin's expression softened slightly. You've given us much to consider, Lady Voss. One way or another, you'll have your answer soon. Petrov led her out and down more corridors to a suite of rooms that were far nicer than anything Lillian had been given before. There was a sitting room with a fireplace, a bedroom with a four-poster bed, and windows that looked out over the city. Well, Petrov said, that could have gone worse. Could it? Lillian asked. Her hands were shaking now that the interview was over. You're still alive. That's generally a good sign. Petrov headed for the door. There's food in the sitting room. Rest. They'll send for you when they're ready. She left, and Lillian was alone again. She crossed to the window and looked out at Valdor spreading below her, thousands of lives being lived in all those buildings, all those streets. Somewhere out there, in this foreign city and a foreign empire, she was going to make a new life. Or she was going to die trying. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she felt almost calm. She'd played her hand, made her gamble. Now all she could do was wait to see if it paid off. The knock came 3 hours later, after dark. Lillian had been sitting by the fire, unable to eat, unable to rest, just staring into the flames and thinking about all the ways this could go wrong. When the guard announced that the council wanted to see her again, her stomach dropped. This was it, the decision. The council chamber looked different at night, lit by lamps that threw long shadows across the walls. The ministers were still there, all 7 of them, but their expressions had changed. They looked tired, like they'd been arguing for hours. Katerin stood as Lillian entered. We've reviewed your intelligence, verified what we could, debated the risks and potential benefits of accepting your offer. She paused. We have questions. More questions, Lillian asked. Different questions. About what you want. Katerin gestured for her to sit. You've given us valuable intelligence and the means to decode more. But you're also a runaway duchess with no resources, no allies, and presumably no interest in going back to Blackridge. So what exactly are you asking for in return? It was the question Lillian had been dreading and preparing for in equal measure. What did she want? Safety, obviously. Protection from Rowan and whatever forces he might send after her. But she'd traveled too far and risked too much to settle for just survival. I want a position, she said. Something official. I want to be part of your intelligence apparatus, using my knowledge of Blackridge's systems to help you exploit them. I want respect, authority, and the guarantee that I'll never be dismissed or ignored or locked away because I'm inconvenient. The ministers exchanged glances. One of the men, heavy-set, with a general's bearing, laughed. You're asking to be employed? As a spy? I'm asking to be recognized for what I actually am, Lillian said. A strategic analyst, a cryptographer, someone who spent 5 years running military operations for an entire duchy and got nothing but neglect in return. You want my intelligence? Fine. But I won't hand it over just to be patted on the head and pensioned off to some quiet estate where I can be forgotten again. Bold, murmured one of the women. Stupid, said another. Interesting, said Katerin. She was studying Lillian with renewed attention. You realize what you're asking for would make you a traitor? That if you're ever captured by Blackridge forces, they'll execute you? They were going to lock me away anyway, Lillian said. At least this way I'll have earned it. Silence fell over the chamber. The ministers looked at each other, having some wordless conversation that Lillian couldn't follow. Finally, Katerin nodded. Very well. We accept your terms, with conditions. You'll work under Minister Vale, helping to decrypt intercepted Blackridge communications and providing analysis on their strategic capabilities. You'll be given quarters here in the palace, a salary, and protection, but you'll also be watched. If we suspect you're feeding us false information or working against our interests, the consequences will be severe. I understand, Lillian said. I hope you do. Katerin's smile was cold. Welcome to the Valdorian Empire, Lady Voss. I suggest you make yourself useful. The meeting ended, and Lillian was escorted back to her quarters in a daze. It had worked. Against all odds, against all reason, her desperate gamble had actually worked. She had a position, protection, a future that belonged to her and no one else. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, she just felt exhausted. Lillian collapsed onto the bed without undressing and stared at the ceiling. Somewhere far to the south, Rowan was probably panicking, his carefully constructed reputation crumbling as he tried to function without her invisible support. His reports would be gibberish now, his orders confused, his entire system falling apart. And she was here, in an enemy capital, about to help dismantle everything he'd built. The irony was almost funny. Almost. Lillian woke to gray morning light and the sound of bells ringing across the city. For a moment, she forgot where she was, her mind still tangled in half-remembered dreams of frozen rivers and coded messages. Then reality settled back into place. She was in Valdor, in the palace, employed by a foreign empire to dismantle her husband's reputation, one decoded message at a time. She sat up and found a servant waiting by the door, a young woman with sharp eyes and the kind of patient stillness that suggested she'd been standing there for a while. Minister Vale sent me, the servant said in Valdorian. He wants you in the cipher room within the hour. The cipher room? Where the cryptographers work. I'll show you. The servant gestured toward a wardrobe. There's clothing for you, something more practical than what you arrived in. The clothes turned out to be simple but well made. Wool trousers, a linen shirt, a vest with multiple pockets. Men's clothing, essentially, though tailored to fit her. Lillian stared at them for a moment, trying to remember the last time she'd worn anything that wasn't a dress designed to make her look decorative and harmless. She put them on and found they fit surprisingly well. The servant nodded approval and led her out into the palace's labyrinthine corridors. The cipher room was in a secure wing of the palace, behind 2 sets of guards and a door that required 3 different keys to open. Inside, it looked like a scholar's fever dream. Tables covered in papers, walls lined with reference books, and half a dozen people hunched over documents with the intense focus of monks copying scripture. Minister Vale looked up from his own cluttered desk and waved her over. He'd traded his formal robes for shirt sleeves and an ink-stained apron, which somehow made him look more intimidating instead of less. Lady Voss. Good. We've intercepted 17 messages from Blackridge in the past week, all encrypted with the system you described. He handed her a stack of papers. I need them decoded. Today, if possible. Lillian took the stack and felt her stomach sink. 17 messages wasn't impossible, but it would take hours of concentrated work. Do you have the materials I'll need? Clean paper, multiple pens. Already prepared. Vale pointed to an empty desk in the corner, where supplies waited in neat stacks. That's your station. The others will leave you alone unless you have questions. We work in silence here. It aids concentration. Understood. She settled at her new desk and started on the first message. The code was familiar. She'd written it, after all, but decryption still required careful attention to detail. One transposed letter could throw off an entire paragraph. She worked methodically, letting muscle memory guide her through the layers of substitution and rearrangement. The first message was a routine supply requisition. The second was a personnel transfer. The third made her pause. It was from Rowan, addressed to the Marcher Lords, marked urgent. Lillian decoded it twice to make sure she'd read it correctly. To all loyal subjects of Blackridge, the Duchess Voss has been taken ill with a severe fever and is currently under the care of physicians. She is not receiving visitors at this time. Any correspondence should be directed to the Duke's office. Signed, Duke Rowan Hale. So that was the story he was telling. Not that she'd run, not that she'd stolen classified documents and fled to an enemy empire. Just a convenient illness to explain her absence while he figured out what to do. Lillian set the decoded message aside and moved to the next one. This was also from Rowan, sent 3 days after the first, to someone named Lord Blackwood. The situation with my wife has become complicated. I require discreet assistance in locating a missing person. Substantial reward offered. Respond by courier, not through official channels. Her hands tightened on the pen. So he was looking for her, but quietly, without involving the official apparatus that might ask uncomfortable questions. Smart, in a panicked sort of way. Less smart was putting it in writing and sending it through a cipher system he no longer controlled. She decoded the rest of the messages. More lies about her health, more discreet inquiries about her whereabouts, and one particularly desperate note to Isadora that made Lillian's jaw clench. Without L's system, I can barely manage basic communications. The Marcher Lords are asking questions I cannot answer. We need her back, or we need a new solution. Time is running out. Good, Lillian thought with vicious satisfaction. Let him squirm. By midday, she'd finished all 17 messages. Vale reviewed them with the focused attention of a jeweler examining diamonds, making notes in the margins, occasionally asking her to verify a particular phrase or decode a section again. This is excellent work, he said finally. Fast, accurate, and you've caught nuances in the phrasing that give us context beyond the literal meaning. He paused. Though I imagine some of these were difficult to read, personal, I mean. I've read worse, Lillian said, which wasn't quite a lie. I'm sure you have. Vale gathered the decoded messages into a folder. The council will want to see these. In the meantime, I have another task for you. He led her to a different table where a large map of the border regions was spread out, marked with pins and notation in both Valdorian and what looked like military shorthand. We're trying to map Black Ridge's defensive positions, Vale said, based on intercepts and scout reports. But there are gaps, areas where the information doesn't make sense or seems deliberately misleading. He tapped several locations on the map. You built their intelligence system. You know how they think. Help us fill in the blanks. Lillian studied the map. She could see immediately what was confusing them. Rowan's forces had deployed using a pattern that looked random, but was actually based on a specific theoretical model she'd adapted from an old military treatise. The Valdorians were trying to find logic in the wrong framework. Here, she said, pointing to a cluster of pins. This position looks exposed, but it's not. There's a supply cache hidden 3 miles north and a rapid response force stationed here, she indicated an unmarked valley, that can reinforce within hours. The deployment only makes sense if you assume they're willing to sacrifice the forward position to draw attackers into a trap. Vale made rapid notes. And here? This garrison seems understaffed. It is, but it's also a communications hub. They're betting on early warning more than defensive strength. Lillian traced lines on the map with her finger. The real defensive depth is here and here, overlapping fields of fire, fallback positions already prepared. It's designed to bog down an invasion force, not stop it at the border. For the next 2 hours, she walked Vale through Black Ridge's defensive strategy, explaining the logic behind deployments that had probably seemed incomprehensible to Valdorian analysts. It felt strange, giving away secrets she'd worked so hard to create, but it also felt freeing, like lancing a wound and letting the poison drain. When they finished, Vale was looking at her with something approaching respect. You really did build all of this, didn't you? The whole system. Most of it. Rowan contributed the ability to look handsome on a horse and take credit convincingly. Vale laughed, startled. I like you, Lady Voss. You have a refreshing lack of sentiment about your betrayal. It's not betrayal if they were planning to lock me away, Lillian said. It's just self-preservation with professional applications. She worked in the cipher room for the next 2 weeks, falling into a routine that felt more natural than anything she'd done in Black Ridge. Decode intercepts in the morning, analyze strategic patterns in the afternoon, occasionally brief members of the council on specific questions about Black Ridge's capabilities. The work was engaging, challenging, and most importantly, acknowledged. People thanked her, asked her opinion, treated her like she had value beyond her ability to stay quiet and look pleasant. It should have been perfect. But there was a tension building beneath the surface, a sense of something waiting just beyond her awareness. On the 16th day, Minister Catherine summoned her to a private meeting. The High Minister's office was smaller than Lillian had expected, more library than throne room, with books lining every wall and a desk buried under neat stacks of correspondence. Catherine sat behind it, reading a report, and didn't look up when Lillian entered. Sit, she said, gesturing to a chair. Lillian sat and waited. She'd learned that Catherine operated on her own timeline and didn't appreciate being rushed. Finally, the High Minister set the report aside and looked at her. You've been productive. Vale speaks highly of your work. The Council is pleased. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Catherine's expression was unreadable. We have a problem. 2 days ago, Duke Hale sent an official communication to our ambassador, requesting a meeting to discuss what he terms a matter of mutual concern. He's claiming his wife was abducted by Valdorian agents and is being held against her will. Lillian's stomach went cold. That's a lie. Of course it's a lie. But it's a useful lie from his perspective. It gives him an excuse to demand your return without admitting he lost control of his own wife and his intelligence apparatus. Catherine leaned back in her chair. He's also offered a substantial reward for information leading to your recovery. 20,000 gold marks. He doesn't have that kind of money, Lillian said automatically. Perhaps not. But the offer is public now. There are bounty hunters from 3 kingdoms who would slit your throat for half that amount. Catherine's gaze was steady. You've become a problem, Lady Voss. An expensive, complicated problem that's threatening to destabilize the peace treaty we just negotiated. What are you saying? I'm saying the council is divided. Half of them want to keep you, exploit your knowledge, and tell Duke Hale to go hang himself. The other half wants to hand you back and avoid a diplomatic incident that could restart the war. Catherine paused. I'm telling you this because you deserve to know your position is not as secure as you might have thought. Lillian's hands clenched in her lap. You gave me your word. Protection, employment, I gave you conditional protection. The conditions have changed. Catherine's voice wasn't unkind, just matter of fact. If the council votes to return you, I won't be able to stop them. The best I can do is give you warning. How long do I have? The vote is in 3 days. You have until then to make yourself indispensable. Catherine picked up her report again. I suggest you work fast. Lillian left the office feeling like the ground had turned to ice beneath her feet. 3 days. She had 3 days to prove her value beyond any doubt, or she'd be shipped back to Blackridge in chains. She went back to the cipher room and threw herself into work with desperate focus. She decoded every intercept she could get her hands on, wrote detailed analyses of Blackridge's military capabilities, drafted reports on weaknesses in their defensive positions. She worked through meals, through the night, until her eyes burned and her hands cramped. Vale found her at her desk at 3 in the morning, surrounded by papers, half asleep over a partially decoded message. This is impressive dedication, he said. Also stupid. You're no good to anyone if you collapse from exhaustion. I have 3 days, Lillian said without looking up. Catherine told me. 3 days before the council votes on whether to send me back. Vale was quiet for a moment. I know I'm one of the votes. That made her look up. And? I haven't decided yet. He pulled up a chair and sat down. You're valuable, but you're also a political liability. If keeping you means restarting the war, then your intelligence isn't worth the cost. So what would make me worth it? Lillian asked. What would make keeping me more valuable than peace? Proof, Vale said simply. Proof that you can give us an advantage so significant that the political risk becomes acceptable. Something beyond decoded messages and strategic analysis. Something that changes the game entirely. Lillian stared at him, her exhausted mind trying to work through the implications. Then it hit her. The winter ball, she said. What? Rowan is hosting a winter ball. It's tradition. Every year the Duke invites all the Marcher lords, the neighboring nobility, anyone with political influence. It's part celebration, part networking, part intelligence gathering. She grabbed a decoded intercept from earlier in the week. This message mentions it. February 15th, 3 weeks from now. I'm not seeing the relevance, Vale said. The relevance is that I can get you inside. Lillian's mind was racing now, exhaustion forgotten. I know the manor's layout, the security protocols, the guest list. I know where Rowan keeps his private correspondence, his real records, the ones that don't go through the cipher system because they're too sensitive. Financial documents, alliance agreements, blackmail material, everything he uses to maintain control. Vale's expression sharpened. You're suggesting an intelligence operation during a major social event. I'm suggesting we take advantage of an opportunity, send agents in as guests. I'll tell you who to impersonate, how to move through the manor without raising suspicion, where to look. Lillian leaned forward. Rowan's power is built on secrets. Take those secrets, and you take his ability to hold the duchy together. That's worth more than decoded messages. That's leverage. It's also incredibly risky, Vale said. If we're caught, it would be an act of war. If I'm sent back, I'll be locked in a sanitarium for the rest of my life, Lillian countered. I'll take the risk over the certainty. Vale studied her for a long moment. Then he stood. I'll present it to the council. No promises. But if you can make this work, if you can give us that kind of access, it might be enough to swing the vote. He left, and Lillian sat alone in the cipher room, staring at the decoded messages spread across her desk. She'd just proposed something insane, an operation that could get people killed, that could restart the war, that could fail in a dozen different ways. But it was also brilliant, and if it worked, it would prove beyond any doubt that she was worth more alive and working for Valdoria than dead or returned to Black Ridge. She just had to make sure it worked. The next morning, Lillian was summoned to a meeting with the full council. They sat around their long table, 7 faces showing varying degrees of skepticism, interest, and outright hostility. Caterin presided from the head, her expression giving nothing away. Minister Vale has informed us of your proposal, Caterin said. An intelligence operation disguised as attendance at a social event designed to extract sensitive documents from Duke Hale's private records. Yes, High Minister, Lillian said. It's audacious, potentially very valuable, also potentially catastrophic if it fails. Caterin gestured to the ministers. We have concerns. The heavy-set general, Minister Gregor, spoke first. How do we know this isn't a trap? You could be luring our agents into an ambush. To what end? Lillian asked. If I wanted to help Rowan, I would have stayed in Black Ridge. Coming here, giving you my intelligence, decoding your intercepts. None of that makes sense if I'm working against you. Unless it's all misdirection, suggested Minister Orlov, a thin man with suspicious eyes. Feed us real intelligence to build trust, then use that trust to get our people killed. That's an elaborate plan for someone who barely escaped with her life, Lillian said. But if you don't trust me, don't send anyone. Keep decoding intercepts, analyzing from a distance, and hope Rowan doesn't figure out a new cipher system, or take the risk and get access to information you can't obtain any other way. Arrogant, muttered one of the women. Confident, corrected Vale. There's a difference. Caterin raised a hand for silence. Let's be practical. Lady Voss, walk us through exactly how this would work. Lillian had prepared for this. She'd spent hours mapping it out, considering every angle, every potential failure point. Now she laid it out, step by step. The winter ball is attended by approximately 200 guests. The manor has standard security, guards at the gates, patrols in the main halls, but nothing in the guest wings or private areas. Rowan's study is on the 3rd floor, East Wing. The safe where he keeps sensitive documents requires a combination I can provide. During the ball, he'll be occupied with hosting, speeches, dancing, drinking with the Marcher Lords. That gives you a 3-hour window, maybe 4. How do we get agents inside? Asked Minister Chen, a sharp-eyed woman who ran Valdoria's foreign intelligence operations. Invitations are sent to specific families, but guest lists are flexible. Nobles bring attendants, distant relatives, unexpected visitors. You create false identities, minor nobility from outlying regions, people Rowan wouldn't know personally but couldn't risk offending by turning away. Lillian pulled out a list she'd prepared. These families are confirmed attendees. Pick ones with large households, claimed to be cousins or in-laws. I'll give you enough background information to pass casual scrutiny. And once inside, Chen pressed, your agents split up. One creates a distraction, something minor, a spilled drink or a small argument, enough to draw attention in the main hall. The others slip away, head to the East Wing. I'll draw you a map. The study door has a standard lock, easy to pick. The safe is more complicated, but I know the combination. You'll give us this combination? Gregor asked. I'll do better than that. I'll go with them. The room erupted. Ministers talked over each other, objecting, questioning, demanding clarification. Caterin let it run for a moment, then cut through the noise. You want to go back to Black Ridge? Into the manor where your husband is actively looking for you? I want to make sure this succeeds, Lillian said. Your agents don't know the layout like I do, don't know Rowan's habits, can't adjust if something goes wrong. I can. And more importantly, I can identify which documents are actually valuable. You could send agents to steal everything in the safe and end up with nothing but personal correspondence and outdated financial records. Or you could be captured and tortured until you reveal everything you know about our operations, Orlov said flatly. I could, but I won't be. Lillian met his gaze. Because I'll have your best agents with me, and I'll know exactly when to get out. I built my entire life around being invisible. Trust me to stay invisible one more time. The council argued for another hour. Gregor thought it was too risky. Orlov thought it was a trap. Chen thought it might work but wanted more details. Vale pointed out that they had limited options and time was running out. Finally, Katerin called for a vote. All in favor of authorizing the operation as proposed, including Lady Voss's participation? 4 hands went up. Vale, Chen, Katerin herself, and a quiet minister named Petrov who hadn't spoken during the entire debate. Opposed? 3 hands. Gregor, Orlov, and the minister who'd called her arrogant. The motion carries, Katerin said. Minister Chen, you'll coordinate with Lady Voss on operational details. Minister Vale, continue overseeing her intelligence work. Everyone else, this operation does not exist outside this room. If it succeeds, we'll have valuable leverage. If it fails, we'll deny all knowledge. The meeting ended, and Lillian found herself in a smaller room with Chen and Vale, spreading maps across a table and planning an operation that would either make her indispensable or get her killed. We'll need at least 4 agents, Chen said, studying the manor layout Lillian had sketched from memory. 1 for distraction, 2 for document extraction, 1 for security and exit coordination. I'd recommend 6, Lillian said. Redundancy. If something goes wrong, you want backup. 6 people is harder to coordinate, more chances for mistakes. Chen tapped the map. This route from the ballroom to the east wing, you're sure it'll be unguarded? During the ball, yes. The guards focus on the main entrances and the treasury. Rowan's paranoid about theft, but assumes no one would dare go after his private papers during a public event. Arrogant, Vale muttered. Useful, Lillian corrected. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, refining the plan, identifying risks, preparing contingencies. Chen was meticulous, catching details Lillian had overlooked, pushing for clarity on every assumption. Vale played devil's advocate, throwing out scenarios where things went wrong and forcing them to plan responses. By the time they finished, Lillian's head was pounding and her stomach was in knots. But they had a plan. Risky, complicated, with a dozen points where it could fall apart, but possible. We'll start preparing the agents tomorrow, Chen said, rolling up the maps. You'll need to brief them personally. Descriptions of key people, behavioral patterns, anything that helps them blend in. Understood, Lillian said. And Lady Voss? Chen's expression was serious. If this goes badly, if you're captured or compromised, we can't come get you. You'll be on your own. I know, Lillian said. I've been on my own for a while now. I'm used to it. The next 2 weeks were a blur of preparation. Lillian worked with the 6 agents Chen had selected, 4 men, 2 women, all experienced in covert operations, but none of them familiar with Blackridge's social dynamics. She drilled them on etiquette, taught them how the local nobility spoke and moved, warned them about people to avoid and conversations to deflect. She also continued her regular work in the cipher room, decoding intercepts that showed Rowan's increasing desperation. His messages were getting sloppy, his decisions more erratic. Without her system to manage information flow, he was drowning in chaos of his own making. One intercept, decoded 3 days before the planned operation, made her pause. It was from Isadora to an unknown recipient, marked urgent. The Duchess must be found before the winter ball. If foreign agents have turned her, she knows enough to destroy us completely. All measures authorized. Bring her back alive if possible. If not possible, ensure she can't talk. Lillian read it twice, her hands steady even as her pulse quickened. They knew. Maybe not the specifics, but they knew she was a threat, and they were willing to kill her to eliminate it. She showed the intercept to Chen. This changes things, Chen said after reading it. They're actively looking for you. Security will be tighter. Or more distracted, Lillian countered. They're looking for external threats. They won't expect me to walk in through the front door. You're assuming they won't recognize you. I've spent 5 years being overlooked in my own home. One more time won't be difficult. Lillian met Chen's gaze. I can do this. The question is whether you trust me to. Chen was quiet for a long moment, then she nodded. We move as planned, but at the first sign of trouble, you abort. I'm not losing agents to prove a point. Agreed. The night before the operation, Lillian couldn't sleep. She sat by her window, looking out at Valdor's lights, and thinking about what came next. In less than 24 hours, she'd be back in Blackridge, walking through the manor where she'd spent 5 years of her life being invisible. Except this time, she'd be invisible on purpose. This time, it would be a weapon. A knock at her door made her turn. Vale stood in the hallway, looking uncomfortable. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked. "No." "Mind if I come in? I brought wine, seemed appropriate for a pre-suicide mission conversation." Despite everything, Lillian smiled. "Come in." They sat by her fireplace, drinking wine that was better than anything Lillian had tasted in Blackridge, talking about nothing important. Vale told stories about his early days as a cryptographer, the mistakes he'd made, the codes he'd broken. Lillian found herself relaxing, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "Can I ask you something?" Vale said eventually. "Why are you really doing this? You could have stayed safe here, kept decoding intercepts, lived a quiet life. Why risk going back?" Lillian considered the question. Because quiet isn't the same as free. I spent 5 years being quiet, being safe, being nothing. I'm done with that. If I'm going to build a new life, it has to be on my terms. That means taking risks. Even if those risks get you killed? Especially then, Lillian said. Better to die trying than live as someone else's problem to be managed. Vale raised his glass. To dangerous choices, then. To dangerous choices, Lillian echoed. They finished the wine, and Vale left. Lillian went to bed and, surprisingly, slept. She woke to pale morning light and the knowledge that today everything changed one way or another. The agents gathered in a secure room, dressed in formal clothing appropriate for a noble's winter ball. Lillian wore a gown she barely recognized, deep burgundy velvet, well made but understated, designed to let her blend into the crowd. Her hair was styled differently, pulled back instead of loose, changing the shape of her face enough to create doubt in anyone who might recognize her. Chen did a final equipment check. The agents carried nothing that would identify them as Valdorian. No weapons beyond what a noble might reasonably carry for protection. No documents, no maps, nothing that couldn't be explained away. "Remember," Chen said, "in and out, 3 hours maximum. If you're not back by midnight, we assume you're compromised and deny all knowledge." The agents nodded. They'd heard this before, but repetition was part of the protocol. "Lady Voss," Chen turned to her, "last chance to back out." "I'm not backing out," Lillian said. "Then let's go." They traveled by fast coach, covering the distance to Blackridge in 8 hours of hard riding. As the familiar walls came into view, Lillian felt her stomach tighten. She'd left 3 weeks ago, cold and desperate and alone. Now she was coming back with a foreign intelligence team, planning to rob her husband in the middle of his own celebration. The irony wasn't lost on her. The manor was ablaze with light, every window glowing, music drifting out into the night air. Carriages lined the drive, guests arriving in a steady stream. The agents split into 2 groups, approaching separately to avoid drawing attention. Lillian went with the second group, her heart pounding as they joined the line of arrivals. A servant checked invitations at the door. The forged documents passed inspection without comment. Then they were inside, swept into the crush of guests filling the grand hall. Lillian kept her head down, her eyes scanning the crowd. There was Lord Garrett, holding court near the refreshment tables. There was Catherine Garrett, laughing at something a young lord was saying. And there, at the center of everything, was Rowan. He looked terrible. His face was drawn, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He smiled and nodded at guests, but the charm was forced, mechanical. This was a man barely holding himself together. Good, Lillian thought viciously. Let him suffer. One of the agents, a woman named Sonia, created the planned distraction, stumbling into a server and sending a tray of glasses crashing to the floor. Heads turned. Rowan moved toward the commotion, playing the concerned host. That was their cue. Lillian and 3 others slipped away from the main hall, moving quickly but not running, just guests stepping away for air or conversation. The corridors were dimly lit and empty, exactly as she'd predicted. They reached the east wing without incident. The study door was locked, but Agent Mikhail had it open in under 30 seconds. They slipped inside, and Lillian moved immediately to the safe hidden behind a false panel in the bookshelf. Her hands shook slightly as she entered the combination. 6 turns right, 3 left, 4 right, 2 left. The safe opened. Inside were stacks of documents, exactly as she'd expected. Lillian pulled them out quickly, sorting through them with practiced efficiency. Financial records showing payments to the Marcher Lords. Bribes, essentially, to maintain their loyalty. Letters from Isadora detailing their plan to have Lillian declared unstable. correspondence with foreign agents that would be very embarrassing if made public, and at the bottom, a contract that made Lillian's blood run cold. It was an agreement between Rowan and a faction in Valdoria, dated 3 months before the peace treaty, offering to provide intelligence on Valdorian troop movements in exchange for favorable terms in the post-war settlement. Rowan had been playing both sides, working with Valdorian traders while pretending to fight them. "Take this," Lillian said, handing the contract to Mikhail. "And these financial records, leave the personal correspondence. It's not worth the wait." They worked quickly, stuffing documents into hidden pockets in their clothing. Lillian took the contract herself, folding it carefully and tucking it inside her bodice. This was the prize. Proof that Duke Hale, celebrated hero of Black Ridge, was a traitor to his own people. "Time," whispered Agent Tomas, who was watching the corridor. "We need to move." They closed the safe, replaced the panel, and slipped back into the hallway. So far, so perfect. They were halfway to the servants' exit when Lillian heard a voice she recognized. "Check the east wing. She's here somewhere. I know she is." Isadora. Lillian's heart stopped. They'd been careful, left no trace, but somehow Isadora knew. Maybe she'd seen something, noticed an absence in the crowd, put pieces together with her sharp, calculating mind. "Split up," Lillian whispered. "Meet at the rendezvous point. Go." The agents scattered. Lillian went the opposite direction, deeper into the east wing, away from the servants' exit. She couldn't lead Isadora to them. If she was caught, it had to be alone. She ducked into a side room, a small library she used to hide in during the worst days of her marriage, and pressed herself against the wall beside the door. Footsteps in the corridor. Multiple people moving systematically, checking rooms. The door opened. A guard entered, holding a lamp high. Lillian held her breath, perfectly still in the shadows. The guard scanned the room and turned to leave. Lillian let out a silent breath of relief. Then Isadora stepped into the doorway. Their eyes met across the darkness, and Lillian saw recognition flare in Isadora's expression. Then something else. Triumph. "Found her!" Isadora called over her shoulder. She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. "Hello, Lillian. You've been missed." "Found her," Isadora called over her shoulder. She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. "Hello, Lillian. You've been missed." Lillian's mind raced through options. The window was too high, the door blocked, and she had no weapons beyond her wits. Isadora stood between her and freedom, holding all the cards. Or so she thought. "You should have stayed hidden," Isadora said, moving closer. "Coming back here? That was arrogant, stupid. Was it?" Lillian kept her voice steady, buying time. The contract was still tucked against her ribs, a paper bomb waiting to detonate. "Or did I get exactly what I came for?" Isadora's eyes narrowed. "Which is what, exactly? A dramatic reunion with your husband? He'll be thrilled to see you, I'm sure, right before he signs the papers to have you committed." "Actually, I came for this." Lillian pulled the contract from her bodice, holding it up so the lamplight caught the ducal seal. "Recognition look familiar?" Isadora went very still. "Where did you get that?" "Your lover's safe, the one he thinks is so secure." Lillian unfolded the document just enough to let Isadora see the header, the signatures. Interesting reading. Didn't realize Rowan was negotiating with Valdorian separatists while simultaneously fighting them. That's what you'd call treason, I believe. "Give me that." Isadora's hand moved toward her belt, where Lillian knew she kept a small blade. Not for fighting, Isadora wasn't a soldier, but for intimidation. "Or what? You'll kill me in the middle of a ball with 200 witnesses nearby?" Lillian stepped sideways, putting a reading table between them. "That seems short-sighted." "I'll call the guards. Have you arrested as a spy?" "Please do." Lillian's smile was cold. "I'm sure Lord Garrett would love to hear my testimony about who's really been running Blackridge's military operations, and who's been selling secrets to both sides of the war." Isadora lunged, not with the knife, but with her hands, going for the contract. Lillian threw the reading table's lamp at her. It shattered against Isadora's shoulder, oil spraying across her dress. The flame caught immediately, bright and hungry. Isadora screamed and stumbled backward, slapping at the fire. Lillian didn't wait. She ran for the door, yanked it open, and collided with a guard who'd come running at the sound of breaking glass. "Fire!" Lillian shouted in his face. Get water, now! The guard hesitated for half a second, then ran toward the servant's stairs, shouting for help. Lillian went the opposite direction, the contract clutched in her fist, her heart hammering so hard she could barely breathe. The corridor erupted into chaos. Servants appeared with buckets. Guests spilled out of the ballroom to see what was happening, and somewhere behind her, Isadora was still screaming. Lillian pushed through the crowd, keeping her head down, just another panicked guest fleeing the excitement. She made it to the main hall before someone grabbed her arm. Lillian, Rowan's voice, tight with barely controlled fury. What have you done? She turned to face him, and the look on his face was almost worth all the risk. He looked destroyed, exhausted, terrified, and furious all at once. This was a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse in real time. Let go of me, Lillian said quietly. Not until you tell me what you're doing here, what you've stolen. His grip tightened. Those were private documents. You had no right. I had every right. Lillian pulled her arm free with a sharp twist. I wrote half of them, remember? Or have you forgotten who actually ran your duchy while you played dress-up soldier? People were staring now. Important people. Lord Garrett had stopped mid-conversation, his attention fixed on them. Catherine Garrett was watching with wide eyes. The Marcher lords had formed a loose circle, drawn by the spectacle of the Duke confronting a strange woman in the middle of his own ball. Rowan seemed to realize their audience at the same moment. His expression shifted, became concerned instead of angry. Darling, you're not well. The fever has clearly— There is no fever, Lillian spoke loudly enough to carry. There never was. I left because I discovered you and your mistress planning to have me declared insane and locked away. I took documents proving I've been the actual strategist behind every military victory you've claimed for 5 years. And tonight, I found proof that you've been committing treason. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the servant stopped moving. Rowan's face went white, then red. That's a lie. She's delusional. Everyone can see Is she? Lord Garrett's voice cut through Rowan's protest. He stepped forward, his sharp eyes fixed on Lillian. I've had my suspicions about your military capabilities, Duke Hale. The strategies attributed to you always seemed beyond your academy training. If what Lady Voss claims is true, it's not true. Rowan's voice cracked. She's unstable. She's been ill. She doesn't know what she's saying. Then you won't mind if she presents her evidence, Garrett said smoothly. Lady Voss, you mentioned documents? Lillian held up the contract. This is an agreement between Duke Hale and a Valdorian faction dated during the war, offering intelligence in exchange for favorable treaty terms. It's signed, sealed, and detailed enough to be prosecuted as high treason. The crowd murmured, shock rippling through the assembled nobility like wind through wheat. Rowan made a grab for the contract, but Garrett was faster, stepping between them. I'd like to examine that, Garrett said. It wasn't a request. Lillian handed it over. Garrett read it quickly, his expression growing grimmer with each line. When he looked up, his gaze went to Rowan. This appears genuine. The seal is correct. The signature matches your hand. Garrett's voice was cold. Would you care to explain why you were negotiating with enemy factions while our sons were dying on the battlefield? It's out of context. It's not what it looks like. Rowan was babbling now, his composure shattered. Lillian, tell them. You know how intelligence works. You know sometimes we have to make deals. I know I never authorized that deal, Lillian said. Which means you made it yourself. Probably with Isadora's help, since she's the one with Valdorian contacts. Isadora? One of the Marcher lords spoke up. You mean your military advisor? The woman from the capital? The woman who's currently on fire in the East Wing, said a servant who'd just emerged from the corridor, breathless. Someone threw a lamp at her. She's screaming about traitors and spies. That was all it took. The careful facade Rowan had maintained for 5 years crumbled completely. The Marcher lords began talking over each other, demanding explanations. Garrett pocketed the contract and gestured to his guards. Catherine Garrett looked like she was watching a play, horrified and fascinated in equal measure. And in the middle of it all, Lillian stood very still, watching Rowan's world disintegrate. Please. Rowan turned to her, and she was startled to see tears in his eyes. Please, don't do this. We can work this out. I'll give you whatever you want. Just don't. I don't want anything from you, Lillian said. Not anymore. She turned and walked toward the exit. The crowd parted for her like water around a stone. No one tried to stop her. Behind her, she heard Garrett ordering Rowan detained for questioning, heard the Marcher Lords calling for an immediate tribunal, heard the beginning of the end of Duke Rowan Hale's glorious reputation. She'd almost made it to the door when someone called her name. "Lady Voss, wait!" She turned to find Minister Vale stepping out of the shadows near the entrance. He was dressed as a minor noble, his disguise good enough that she hadn't recognized him in the crowd. Behind him, the other Valdorian agents were filtering toward the exits in ones and twos, mission accomplished. "That was quite a performance," Vale said quietly. "Did you get what you needed?" Lillian asked. "And then some. Half the Marcher Lords are already talking about replacing Hale. The other half want him executed." Vale's smile was satisfied. "You've just destabilized the entire duchy's power structure in under 10 minutes. Impressive work." "I had good motivation." Lillian glanced back at the chaos in the ballroom. Rowan was being led away by guards, still protesting, still trying to explain. "Can we leave now?" "Absolutely." They made it back to the coaches without incident. As Valdor's walls disappeared behind them, Lillian felt something inside her chest loosen. She'd done it. She'd walked into her old life, stolen proof of Rowan's crimes, exposed him in front of everyone who mattered, and walked out alive. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, she just felt tired. "You know what happens next, don't you?" Vale said as they rode through the darkness. "Blackridge will tear itself apart. The Marcher Lords will fight over succession. The neighboring duchies will see weakness and press their claims. It could be years before they stabilize." "I know," Lillian said. "And you're fine with that? With what you've set in motion?" Lillian thought about it, about the servants who'd ignored her, the guards who'd looked through her, the nobles who'd treated her like furniture. About 5 years of being invisible while the duchy celebrated a man who'd done nothing to earn it. "Yes," she said finally, "I'm fine with it." The journey back to Valdor took 3 days. When they arrived, the council was waiting with news. Blackridge had officially requested extradition for the traitor Duchess who incited rebellion and stole state secrets. The request had been denied, but the political pressure was mounting. "Public opinion in Blackridge is divided," Catherine explained in an emergency session. "Half the duchy wants you executed. The other half thinks you're a hero for exposing Hale's corruption. The Marcher Lords are in open conflict, and there are rumors of civil war." "Good," Lillian said, and meant it. "Good?" Minister Gregor looked appalled. "You've destabilized our neighboring state. That's not good. That's catastrophic." "It's leverage," Lillian corrected. "Blackridge is weak now, divided. That makes them dependent on outside support to maintain order, support you can provide, for a price." The council exchanged glances. Chen was smiling slightly. Vale looked impressed. Even Katarin showed something that might have been approval. "You're suggesting we offer assistance to the faction most favorable to our interests," Katarin said slowly. "Help them consolidate power in exchange for favorable treaties." "I'm suggesting you take advantage of the chaos I just created," Lillian said. "You wanted me to prove my value? This is what value looks like. Not just intelligence, strategic opportunities." The council voted that afternoon. This time, it was unanimous. Lillian would stay. Her position made permanent. Her salary increased. Her authority expanded. She'd proven beyond any doubt that she was worth more alive and working for Valdoria than dead or returned to Blackridge. That night, Lillian stood at her window looking out over the city and allowed herself to feel what she'd been holding back for weeks. Not triumph, not satisfaction. Something quieter and more fundamental. Relief. She'd escaped, not just physically, but completely. She'd walked away from a life that was slowly killing her and built something new in its place, something that belonged to her. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find a messenger with a sealed letter. "From Blackridge, my lady. It came through the diplomatic channels." Lillian took it, recognizing Garrett's seal. She broke it open and read, "Lady Voss, Duke Hale has been removed from power pending investigation into charges of treason. The Marcher Council has assumed temporary governance. We request your testimony regarding his military record and strategic capabilities. In exchange, we offer amnesty and restoration of your titles and properties. The duchy needs stability. You could help provide it. Please consider. Lord Garrett." Lillian read it twice, then walked to her fireplace and dropped it into the flames. She didn't owe Blackridge anything. Not testimony, not assistance, certainly not a return to the place that had tried to erase her. Let them figure out their own stability. She had better things to do. Over the next 2 months, Lillian threw herself into her work with single-minded intensity. She decoded intercepts, analyzed intelligence, and began training a team of junior cryptographers in the techniques she'd developed. The Valdorian intelligence apparatus had been competent before. With her input, it became formidable. But the real work was more subtle. Lillian began crafting a strategy for Valdoria's engagement with Blackridge, not conquest, but influence. She identified which Marcher lords were pragmatic, which were ideological, which could be bought, and which could be manipulated. She drafted trade agreements that favored Valdoria while appearing generous. She designed an intelligence network that would give them eyes throughout the duchy. It was the same kind of work she'd done for Rowan, but this time, people knew she was doing it. Ministers consulted her directly. The council invited her to strategy sessions. Her name appeared on reports and recommendations. She was visible now, recognized, valued. It should have been enough. But there was still one piece missing. "You're brooding," Vale said one afternoon, finding her in the cipher room staring at a decoded message without really seeing it. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," Lillian said. "Everything is fine." "You're a terrible liar." Vale pulled up a chair. "Talk to me." Lillian set down the message. "I destroyed Rowan. I escaped. I proved my worth. I built a new life. I won. So why does it still feel unfinished?" "Because revenge isn't the same as resolution," Vale said. "You hurt him, yes. But you didn't get what you actually wanted." "Which is what?" "Recognition. Not from us, you have that. From them, from the people who overlooked you for 5 years." Vale leaned back. "You want them to know. You want Rowan to understand what he lost. You want everyone in Blackridge to see the truth and realize they were wrong about you." He was right, damn him. Lillian had thought destroying Rowan's reputation would be enough, but it wasn't. Because everyone in Blackridge still thought of her as the unstable duchess who'd run away. They didn't know the whole truth. They didn't understand what she'd actually been. "So what do I do about it?" Lillian asked. "You make them see," Vale said simply. "On your terms. In a way they can't ignore or rationalize away." 3 weeks later, Lillian stood in the council chamber with a proposal. It was audacious, possibly insane, and exactly the kind of power move that would either cement her position or destroy it completely. "You want to do what?" Gregor asked, incredulous. "I want to negotiate the treaty," Lillian repeated, "the permanent peace agreement between Valdoria and Blackridge on behalf of the Empire." "That's traditionally the High Minister's role," Katerin said, but she looked more interested than opposed. "I know their weaknesses better than anyone. I know what they need, what they'll accept, what will make them desperate enough to agree to terms that favor us." Lillian spread a draft agreement across the table. "And more importantly, I know how to make them acknowledge what I actually was, what I actually did." "By forcing Rowan to negotiate with you directly," Chen said, catching on, "making him confront the woman he tried to erase." "Exactly. He's been detained but not formally charged. The Marcher Council doesn't have enough evidence yet for a full treason trial, but they're desperate for a treaty to stabilize the region. If I'm sitting across from him representing the power he needs to negotiate with, he'll have no choice but to treat me as an equal, more than equal, as his superior." The council debated for hours. Gregor thought it was too risky putting their former enemy in such a visible position. Orloff worried it would look like the Empire was being controlled by a Blackridge defector. But Katerin, Chen, and Vale argued that it was exactly the kind of psychological warfare that would give Valdoria a permanent advantage. "If we send Lady Voss," Katerin said finally, "we're not just negotiating a treaty. We're making a statement about where real power lies, about what happens to those who underestimate the people around them." The vote was 5-2 in favor. Lillian would lead the Valdorian delegation to Blackridge for treaty negotiations. The news reached Blackridge 3 days before the delegation was scheduled to arrive. According to the intercepts, the reaction was explosive. The Marcher lords were divided, some outraged that a traitorous duchess would dare return, others pragmatic enough to recognize they had no leverage to refuse. Rowan, still under house arrest, had reportedly thrown furniture when he heard. Good, Lillian thought. Let him rage. Let him understand what was coming. The Valdorian delegation departed on a cold morning in early spring. Lillian rode in the lead carriage with Katerin, who'd decided to accompany her personally. Vale came as well, along with Chen and a full security detail. They weren't taking any chances. As they approached Blackridge's walls, Lillian felt her chest tighten. The last time she'd seen these battlements, she'd been fleeing for her life on a half-dead horse. Now she was returning as a foreign power's chief negotiator, backed by an empire's military might and diplomatic authority. The gates opened. They rode through to the inner courtyard where the Marcher Council waited. Lord Garrett stood at the front, his expression carefully neutral. The other lords ranged behind him, showing varying degrees of hostility, curiosity, and resignation. And standing at the very back, flanked by guards, was Rowan. He looked worse than he had at the Winter Ball. His face was gaunt, his clothes rumpled, his eyes shadowed with the kind of exhaustion that came from weeks of anxiety and rage. When his gaze met Lillian's, she saw hate there, pure, undiluted loathing. She smiled at him. "Lord Garrett," Catherine said, stepping down from the carriage. "Thank you for receiving us. May I present my chief negotiator, Lady Lillian Voss." The formal introduction hung in the air. Lillian descended from the carriage, wearing Valdorian colors now, her bearing confident in a way she'd never allowed herself in this place before. She was done shrinking, done hiding. "Lady Voss." Garrett's tone was complex, respect, wariness, and something that might have been approval all mixed together. "Welcome back to Blackridge." "Thank you, Lord Garrett. Though I should note I'm here in an official capacity, representing the Valdorian Empire. This is not a homecoming." "Of course." Garrett gestured toward the manor. "We prepared chambers for your delegation. The negotiations are scheduled to begin tomorrow morning." They were shown to the guest wing, the same rooms where visiting nobles had stayed during balls and celebrations. Lillian's chamber overlooked the courtyard where she used to watch servants scurry during her self-imposed isolation. The view was familiar, but her perspective had fundamentally changed. That evening, there was a formal dinner, mandatory attendance for all parties. Lillian dressed carefully in a gown that managed to be both diplomatically appropriate and subtly intimidating, deep blue velvet with silver embroidery, the colors of Valdoria's diplomatic corps. When she entered the dining hall, conversation stopped. The seating arrangement put her directly across from Rowan. Deliberate, probably. Someone's idea of forcing a confrontation. Lillian took her seat with calm grace and met his eyes across the table. "Hello, Rowan," she said quietly. "Traitor," he spat. His guards tensed, but he was allowed to speak. "You destroyed everything. Everything I built." "Everything I built," Lillian corrected. "You just stood in front of it and smiled." "I was the Duke. I led the armies. I made the decisions." "You rid the decisions I made and pretended you'd thought of them." Lillian kept her voice level, conversational. "Tell me, how have you been managing without me? Are your reports still coherent? Can you even decode your own correspondence anymore?" Rowan's face went red. "I don't need you. I never needed you. You were just what? A convenient tool? A useful accessory?" Lillian leaned forward slightly. "You needed me so badly that when I left, your entire system collapsed within weeks. That's not what happens when someone is replaceable." "Enough!" Lord Garrett's voice cut through the tension. "This is a diplomatic dinner, not a domestic dispute. Save your grievances for the negotiating table." But Lillian had made her point. Around the table, she could see the Marcher lords reassessing, considering. They'd all known Lillian as the Quiet Duchess, the woman who faded into backgrounds. Seeing her like this, confident, articulate, unafraid, was forcing them to reconsider everything they'd assumed. The dinner proceeded in awkward silence. Lillian ate her meal calmly, occasionally making polite conversation with the ministers beside her. Across from her, Rowan barely touched his food, his hands clenched into fists on the table. When it finally ended, Lillian returned to her chambers and allowed herself a moment of private satisfaction. The first blow had been struck, not with documents or accusations, but with simple presence. She was here, she was powerful, and there was nothing Rowan could do about it. The negotiations began the next morning in the manor's formal conference room. The Blackridge delegation sat on one side of a long table. Lord Garrett, 3 Marcher lords, and Rowan, still under guard but included because he technically remained Duke until formally convicted. The Valdorian delegation sat opposite, Katarin, Lillian, Vale, and Chen. Garrett opened with a formal statement about seeking lasting peace and mutual benefit. Katarin responded with similar diplomatic pleasantries. Then the real work began. The Empire's position is straightforward, Lillian said, unrolling a map. We want guaranteed trade access through your eastern ports, military non-aggression for a minimum of 20 years, and intelligence sharing on threats to regional stability. In exchange, we offer favorable tariff rates, military support against hostile neighbors, and financial assistance for your reconstruction. Those terms are heavily weighted in Valdoria's favor, one of the Marcher lords objected. The trade access alone would give you economic dominance over our eastern territories. Yes, Lillian agreed. That's the point. You need stability and support more than you need economic independence right now. We're offering that, but it comes at a cost. This is extortion, Rowan said. His voice shook with barely controlled rage. You're exploiting our weakness. I'm exploiting the situation you created, Lillian interrupted. If you hadn't been committing treason and mismanaging the duchy's actual strategic capabilities, you wouldn't be in this position. This is consequences, Rowan. Get used to them. Garrett raised a hand before Rowan could respond. Lady Voss has a point, however bluntly stated. We are negotiating from a position of weakness. The question is whether these terms are acceptable given our circumstances. The negotiations continued for hours. They debated tariff rates, disputed border definitions, argued over military commitments. Lillian held her ground on every point, backed by Vale's technical expertise and Chen's understanding of regional politics. The Blackridge delegation tried to push back, but they had no leverage and everyone knew it. During a break, Lillian found herself alone in the corridor with Lord Garrett. He studied her with those sharp, assessing eyes. You were right, he said finally. That day at the banquet, when we talked about strategic studies and complementary interests, you were the one running things all along. Yes, Lillian said simply. Why didn't you say something? Why let him take credit? Because I was 17 when I married him, and I'd been trained my entire life to be quiet and useful and invisible. Lillian met his gaze. By the time I realized I could be more than that, I was too deep in the lie to climb out without destroying everything. So I waited. And when the opportunity came, I took it. Garrett nodded slowly. What you've done, leaving, exposing Hale, coming back like this, it's going to change things. Not just politically, socially. There are other women watching what you've accomplished, other people who've been overlooked and underestimated. Good, Lillian said. Let them watch. Let them learn. The negotiations concluded 3 days later with a treaty heavily favoring Valdoria, but giving Blackridge enough breathing room to stabilize. Both sides signed in a formal ceremony witnessed by nobles from 3 neighboring duchies. Lillian signed for Valdoria, her name inscribed in official records as the treaty's architect and chief negotiator. Rowan was required to attend, but not permitted to sign. He stood at the back of the room, watching with impotent fury as his former wife reshaped his duchy's future. After the ceremony, Katerin pulled Lillian aside. You did well, better than well. You secured terms I didn't think we could get. The council will be pleased. Thank you, High Minister. There's one more thing. Katerin handed her a sealed document. The Marcher Council sent this through official channels this morning. It's for you. Lillian opened it and read. Lady Lillian Voss, in recognition of your previous service to Blackridge and your role in exposing corruption at the highest levels of government, the Marcher Council formally acknowledges your contributions to the Duchy's military successes during the recent war. Your strategic planning and intelligence work were instrumental in our victories. We regret that these contributions were not recognized during your tenure as Duchess. While we cannot undo the past, we can offer this formal acknowledgement and our thanks. The Marcher Council of Blackridge. Lillian stared at the document, reading it 3 times. It wasn't everything. It didn't explicitly say Rowan had been a fraud, didn't detail exactly what she'd done. But it was official recognition, acknowledgement that she had mattered, that her work had value, that she'd been more than just an overlooked wife. They know, Lillian said quietly. They finally know. Yes, Katerin said. And now, so does everyone else. That night, there was a final dinner to celebrate the treaty. Lillian attended wearing the acknowledgement letter like armor. When she entered the hall, people stood. Not for her rank, she had none in Blackridge anymore, but for what she represented. Intelligence over brute force. Strategy over empty glory. The power of being underestimated and turning that underestimation into a weapon. Rowan didn't attend. He'd been formally charged with treason that afternoon, the evidence Lillian had stolen finally processed through official channels. His trial would be held within the month. The outcome was already certain. As the evening wound down, Lord Garrett approached her one final time. "What will you do now?" he asked. "Return to Valdor, continue your intelligence work?" "Yes to both," Lillian said. "I have a position there, responsibilities. A life I built myself." "You could stay here. The Marcher Council would welcome your expertise in rebuilding." Lillian considered it for exactly 3 seconds. "No, thank you, but no. Blackridge had its chance with me. I'm done giving second chances to places that only valued me after I left." Garrett smiled. "Fair enough. Though I suspect we'll be seeing more of you anyway, given the treaty terms." "Probably," Lillian agreed. "But on my terms now. Always on my terms." She returned to Valdor a week later, the Marcher Council's acknowledgement safely packed among her belongings. The city welcomed her back like she'd never left. Her work had continued in her absence. Her team had managed the intercepts. The machinery she'd helped build kept running. But something had changed. When Lillian walked through the palace corridors now, people recognized her. Not as the quiet duchess who'd defected, but as the strategist who'd negotiated a treaty, the intelligence officer who'd helped reshape regional politics, the woman who'd proven that being overlooked was only temporary if you were patient enough and smart enough to wait for your moment. Vale found her in the cipher room that evening, catching up on work she'd missed. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Getting everything you wanted?" Lillian looked up from the decoded intercept she'd been reading. "Is that what I got?" "Isn't it? Recognition, revenge, a position of real power. You've won, Lillian. Completely." She thought about it. About Rowan facing trial, about the Marcher Council's acknowledgement, about her name on a treaty that would shape the region for decades. About the life she'd built here in Valdor, surrounded by people who valued her mind instead of tolerating her presence. "Yes," she said finally. "I suppose I did win, though it doesn't feel the way I expected." "How does it feel?" "Quieter," Lillian said. "Less dramatic. I thought victory would be this bright, triumphant thing. Instead, it's just normal. I wake up, I work, I contribute, people listen. That's it. That's what winning looks like." Vale laughed. "That's because you're thinking like a strategist, not a storyteller. Strategists know that real victory isn't a single dramatic moment. It's the accumulation of small advantages that eventually become insurmountable." He was right. Lillian had spent 5 years accumulating knowledge, building systems, creating value that only she could provide. Then she'd spent weeks turning those advantages into leverage. The dramatic moments, the escape, the confrontation, the negotiations. Those were just the visible manifestations of work done in shadows. The real victory had happened long before anyone noticed. "I need to send a message," Lillian said suddenly, "to Blackridge, to Rowan specifically." "What kind of message?" "The kind that makes sure he understands exactly what he lost." She drafted it carefully, encoding it in the system she'd created, knowing Rowan no longer had the key to decode it, knowing he'd have to beg someone else to translate it for him, knowing that helplessness would eat at him more than any words could. The message was simple. "Thank you for teaching me the value of invisibility. I couldn't have done any of this if you'd actually paid attention." She sent it through official channels, where it would be intercepted, decoded by Blackridge's struggling intelligence apparatus, and eventually delivered. And then she went back to work, building her new life one decoded message at a time. 2 weeks later, Chen brought her news from Blackridge. Rowan's trial had concluded. He'd been found guilty of treason and stripped of his title and lands. The death sentence had been commuted to permanent exile on the condition that he never set foot in Blackridge or any allied duchy again. Isidore had disappeared during the trial, fled to parts unknown, her testimony given in absentia and largely useless without physical evidence. The duchy was being reorganized under Marcher Council governance, with Lord Garrett named as interim duke until a permanent solution could be established. "Your message reached him, by the way," Chen said. "According to our sources, he threw the decoded version into a fire and didn't speak for 3 days afterward." Lillian smiled. Good. She felt no guilt, no regret, no lingering attachment to the man she'd once called husband. He'd made his choices. She'd made hers. And hers had led to survival, power, and a future that belonged entirely to her. That evening, Katerin summoned her to the council chamber for what she called a matter of some importance. Lillian went curious and found the full council assembled. Lady Voss, Katerin said formally, in recognition of your service to the Empire and your exceptional work in securing favorable treaty terms with Blackridge, the Council has voted to offer you a permanent position as Minister of Foreign Intelligence. You would oversee all cryptographic operations, manage strategic analysis, and coordinate intelligence gathering across our sphere of influence. The role comes with a seat on this council and all the authority that entails. Lillian stared at her. A council seat, real power, not just influence. A position that couldn't be stripped away or diminished. I accept, she said. The council members stood, and for the first time since she'd arrived in Valdor, Lillian felt something like belonging. Not because they liked her or approved of her, this was politics, not friendship, but because they recognized her value and were willing to give her the authority to use it. That night, Lillian stood at her window, looking out over the city, and thought about the girl she'd been 5 years ago. 17. Overlooked, married off to secure an alliance, taught to be quiet and useful and invisible. That girl would never have imagined standing here, in a foreign capital, holding real power and answering to no one but herself. She'd come a long way from the frozen river and the desperate escape, come a long way from being the invisible architect behind someone else's glory. Now finally, she was building something for herself, and no one would ever be able to take that away. Now finally, she was building something for herself, and no one would ever be able to take that away. Lillian's first act as Minister of Foreign Intelligence was to dismantle the cipher system she'd created for Blackridge and replace it with something better. Something Rowan had never seen, could never decode, would never understand even if he somehow got his hands on it. She spent 3 weeks locked in the cipher room with Vale and her team, designing layers of encryption that made her original work look like a child's puzzle. "This is beautiful," Vale said, studying the new system. "Elegant and brutal at the same time. How long would it take someone to crack this?" Without the key? Years. Maybe decades. Lillian made a final notation. "And I've built in trap sequences. Anyone trying to break it through pattern analysis will get convincing but completely false intelligence." "You're terrifying, you know that?" "Good. Terrifying keeps people honest." The new system went into effect immediately, rolling out across Valdoria's entire intelligence network. Within a month, their information gathering became so efficient that neighboring kingdoms started complaining about Valdorian spies being everywhere at once. They weren't. They were just better organized, better coordinated, and led by someone who understood that intelligence was about architecture, not just individual pieces of information. But Lillian's real focus was on Blackridge, not revenge anymore. That chapter was closed. This was strategic cultivation, turning a former enemy into a dependent ally. She coordinated trade agreements that made Blackridge economically reliant on Valdorian markets. She placed intelligence assets throughout the duchy's new government, people who reported directly to her. She ensured that every major decision the Marcher Council made was influenced, however subtly, by Valdorian interests. Lord Garrett noticed, of course. He sent a private letter 3 months into her tenure as minister. "Lady Voss, I'm not blind to what you're doing. Blackridge is becoming a Valdorian satellite state in everything but name. I should probably object, but I remember what we were like under Hale's leadership. Corrupt, unstable, bleeding resources. Now we're prosperous and secure. If the price for that is acknowledging Valdorian influence, so be it. Though I wonder, is this strategy or is this personal?" Garrett Lillian wrote back, "Lord Garrett, strategy and personal motivation aren't mutually exclusive. Yes, I'm ensuring Valdoria benefits from Blackridge's reconstruction. I'm also ensuring Blackridge never again empowers an incompetent leader who mistakes charm for capability. If that serves both my interests and the duchy's well-being, everyone wins. Except Rowan, of course. But I think we can both live with that." L. Voss, Minister of Foreign Intelligence. Garrett's response came a week later. A bottle of excellent wine and a note that said simply, "Touché." 6 months into her new position, Lillian received an unexpected visitor. Commander Petrov arrived at the palace requesting a private meeting, which was unusual enough that Lillian cleared her afternoon schedule. "I have information," Petrov said, settling into a chair in Lillian's office. "About Isadora Crane." Lillian set down her pen. "I'm listening." "She surfaced in the Free Cities trying to sell intelligence to the highest bidder. military secrets, trade routes, cipher fragments. Most of it outdated or useless, but she's desperate enough to be dangerous. Petrov handed over a report. Local authorities asked if we wanted her extradited. I thought you should decide. Lillian read through the report. Isadora was living in a cheap boarding house, drinking too much, burning through money she didn't have. The woman who'd once been Rowan's brilliant military advisor had been reduced to peddling scraps of information to minor criminal organizations. Let her go, Lillian said finally. Petrov raised an eyebrow. She tried to have you locked away. She helped Hale commit treason. You don't want justice? I want her to live with what she's become. Lillian set the report aside. Bringing her back, putting her on trial, that makes her important again. Leaving her where she is, forgotten and desperate, selling worthless secrets in a third-rate city? That's better than any punishment I could design. Cold, Petrov said, but she was smiling. I like it. I'll inform the authorities she's not worth our resources. After Petrov left, Lillian sat for a while thinking about Isadora. There was a time when she would have wanted revenge, would have demanded Isadora face consequences for what she'd done. But that desire had faded. Revenge required caring about your enemies, and Lillian found she simply didn't anymore. Isadora was irrelevant. Rowan was irrelevant. They'd had their chance to matter, and they'd wasted it. Lillian had more important things to do. The winter after her appointment brought a crisis that tested everything she'd built. The Eastern Coalition, a loose alliance of kingdoms on Valdoria's border, began mobilizing troops. Intelligence suggested they were planning a coordinated invasion, betting that Valdoria's recent treaty with Blackridge had weakened its military focus. They were wrong, but they didn't know that yet. The council convened in emergency session. Minister Gregor wanted immediate military mobilization. Minister Orlov advocated for diplomatic outreach. The others were divided, uncertain which approach would work. Minister Voss, Katrin said, you've been quiet. What's your assessment? Lillian had spent the past week analyzing intercepts, coordinating with field agents, building a complete picture of the coalition's plans. Now she spread that intelligence across the table. Troop movements, supply routes, internal communications between coalition leaders. They're not actually unified, she said. 3 of the 5 kingdoms are committed to invasion. The other 2 are participating because they're afraid of being left out. If we can fracture that commitment, the whole thing collapses. How do we fracture it? Chen asked. We make it personal. Lillian pulled out a specific intercept. King Marcus of Westmarch is leading the coalition, but he's also deeply in debt to King Stefan of Nordheim. If we expose that debt publicly, along with evidence that Marcus plans to use conquered Valdorian territory to pay it off, the other kingdoms will realize they're fighting for Westmarch's benefit, not their own. You have evidence of this? Gregor asked skeptically. I have Marcus's private correspondence with his treasurer, decoded and verified. I have loan documents. I have a letter where he explicitly describes using liberated Valdorian resources to settle his obligations. Lillian laid them out one by one. We leak these through diplomatic channels, let the other coalition members see what they're really fighting for, and watch the alliance tear itself apart. The council stared at the documents. Katerin picked up the letter, read it twice, and started laughing. How long have you had this? She asked. 3 days. I was waiting to see if military mobilization became necessary before using it. Seemed wasteful to burn intelligence assets if we could resolve this diplomatically. This is why we made you a minister, Katerin said. Gregor, Chen, coordinate the leaks. Make sure they reach the right people at the right time. Orlov, prepare diplomatic overtures to the kingdoms most likely to break away. We'll give them a graceful exit from the coalition in exchange for neutrality. The plan worked better than Lillian had dared hope. Within 2 weeks, the Eastern Coalition was in chaos. 2 kingdoms withdrew their support publicly. A third recalled its troops to deal with internal matters. King Marcus tried to hold the alliance together, but without unified support, the invasion plans collapsed. Within a month, the coalition had dissolved entirely, and Valdoria hadn't fired a single shot. The council meeting following the crisis was a celebration. Ministers who'd been skeptical of Lillian's appointment were now singing her praises. Even Gregor admitted grudgingly that her approach had saved lives and resources. To Minister Voss, Katrin said, raising a glass, who just prevented a war through nothing but intelligence and strategic thinking. The Empire owes you a debt. The Empire pays me well enough, Lillian said. I'd call us even. But that night, Alone in her office, she allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. She'd prevented a war, not by hiding behind someone else's reputation, not by letting someone else take credit, but through her own work, under her own name. That meant something, maybe everything. A year into her position as minister, Lillian received a letter that made her pause mid-morning coffee. It was from Blackridge, but not from Garrett. The seal belonged to the Athenaeum, her old academy. Dear Minister Voss, we are writing to request your participation in our annual symposium on strategic studies and modern intelligence. Your work on cryptographic systems and diplomatic strategy has become required reading in our advanced courses. We would be honored if you would present a lecture on the development of multi-layered cipher systems and their practical applications in modern statecraft. The symposium will be held in Blackridge in 3 months. We understand this may present personal complications, but your insights would be invaluable to the next generation of strategic theorists. Please consider. Dean Matthias, The Athenaeum. Lillian read it 3 times, emotions churning. The Athenaeum. The place where she'd first learned strategic theory, where professors had praised her mind but suggested she'd never have opportunity to use it practically. They wanted her to lecture, to teach, to be recognized as an expert in her field. It was tempting, but it was also in Blackridge, the place she'd left behind. She showed the letter to Vale over dinner that evening. "Are you going to go?" he asked. "I don't know. Part of me wants to stand in front of those students and prove that everything the Academy said was impossible actually wasn't, but another part thinks it's a step backward. Why should I care about their validation?" "Because validation from the people who doubted you is different from validation from the people who always believed in you," Vale said. "Not better, necessarily, but different. Closure, maybe." Lillian thought about it for a week before responding. Finally, she wrote, "Dear Dean Matthias, I accept your invitation. I'll present on practical applications of advanced cryptography in intelligence operations. Fair warning, I don't soften my conclusions for academic comfort. If your students can't handle reality, they shouldn't be studying strategy. Minister L. Voss." The response came quickly. "We wouldn't expect anything less. See you in 3 months." The journey back to Blackridge felt different this time. Lillian traveled openly with a small diplomatic escort but no security concerns. The duchy had stabilized under Marcher Council governance. The economy was recovering, and Valdorian influence had made the region more peaceful than it had been in decades. When they arrived, Lord Garrett met them personally at the gates. "Minister Voss," he said with a slight bow, "welcome back. Again." "Lord Garrett, how's the duchy treating you?" "Better now that we're not running on lies and borrowed glory." He gestured toward a waiting carriage. "I've arranged accommodations for you and your party. The Athenaeum is expecting you tomorrow afternoon for a preliminary meeting." They rode through streets Lillian remembered but barely recognized. New construction everywhere, markets bustling with trade goods from 3 kingdoms, people moving with the energy of a place that had hope again. Whatever damage she'd done by exposing Rowan's corruption, Blackridge had recovered. That evening, Garrett invited her to dinner at his estate. It was smaller than Rowan's manor but more comfortable, without the oppressive formality that had defined her old life. "I wanted to thank you," Garrett said over wine, "for what you did. I know that sounds strange, given you technically betrayed the duchy, but you exposed rot that would have eventually destroyed us. Better a painful cure than a slow death." "I didn't do it for Blackridge," Lillian said honestly. "I did it for me. The duchy benefiting was just convenient." "I know. That's what makes it effective. You weren't trying to save us, you were just surviving. But in surviving, you forced us to face truths we'd been avoiding." Garrett refilled her glass. "The Marcher Council has been discussing formally pardoning you, restoring your citizenship, your properties. It wouldn't change anything practically. You're a Valdorian minister now, but symbolically—" "No," Lillian said immediately. Garrett blinked. "No? I don't want a pardon. I don't want my properties back. I don't want anything that suggests I needed Blackridge's permission to do what I did." Lillian met his eyes. "I left. I built a new life. I don't need validation from the place that tried to erase me. I'm here to lecture at the Academy, not to reconcile with my past." Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. "Fair enough, though for what it's worth, I think you've earned the right to be bitter." "I'm not bitter," Lillian said. "I'm just done. There's a difference." The Athenaeum hadn't changed much in 6 years. Same stone buildings, same manicured grounds, same atmosphere of focused academic intensity. Lillian walked through the gates feeling like she was stepping into a memory, except this time she was the visiting expert instead of the overlooked student. Dean Matthias met her in his office, an elderly scholar with kind eyes and a mind still sharp enough to teach advanced theory. He'd been one of her professors, back when she'd been 17 and trying to prove she belonged in rooms full of men twice her age. "Lillian," he said, gripping her hand firmly, "look at you. Minister of Foreign Intelligence. When you were my student, I knew you were brilliant, but I never imagined that I'd get the chance to use it?" Lillian finished. "Neither did I, honestly." "Well, you've certainly made the most of your opportunities." Matthias gestured for her to sit. "I've read your published work on cipher systems. Fascinating stuff, light years beyond what we teach here." "You should update your curriculum then. Half of what you're teaching is obsolete," Matthias laughed. "That's why we invited you, to tell us exactly that, preferably in front of the students who think they know everything already." They discussed the lecture format, the topics Lillian would cover, the kind of questions she might face. Matthias warned her that some students might be hostile. She was, after all, technically a defector who'd worked against Blackridge's interests. "Let them be hostile," Lillian said. "I've faced worse than argumentative students." The lecture was scheduled for the following afternoon in the Academy's largest hall. When Lillian arrived, she found it packed. Students filled every seat, and faculty members stood along the walls. Word had spread that the infamous Lillian Voss was speaking, and apparently everyone wanted to see the woman who'd brought down a duke and rebuilt her life in an enemy empire. Lillian took the podium and looked out at the crowd. Some faces showed curiosity, some skepticism, some outright hostility. She'd expected nothing less. "I'm going to start with a question," she said, her voice carrying across the hall. "How many of you believe that strategic brilliance is inherent? That some people are simply born with the ability to see patterns, anticipate moves, build systems that others can't?" A few hands went up uncertainly. "Wrong. Strategic thinking is a skill. It can be learned, practiced, refined. What can't be taught is the willingness to do it anyway when everyone around you insists you're wasting your time." Lillian paused. "I was told, repeatedly, that my education was decorative, that noble women didn't need strategic theory because we'd never be allowed to apply it. I studied anyway. And when opportunity came, when I married someone with authority but no competence, I used what I'd learned. Not because I was brilliant, because I was prepared." She launched into her lecture, walking them through the development of her cipher system, the practical applications in intelligence work, the ways modern cryptography shaped diplomatic relations. She didn't soften her language or simplify her concepts. These were advanced students. They could keep up, or they couldn't. An hour in, a young man in the front row raised his hand. "Minister Voss, you keep referring to practical applications. But isn't it true that your work ultimately betrayed Blackridge? That you used these skills against your own people?" The hall went silent. This was the question everyone wanted to ask, but most were too polite to voice. "Define my own people," Lillian said calmly. "The husband who planned to have me locked away? The nobility who ignored me for 5 years while taking advantage of my work? The duchy that valued me only as long as I stayed invisible?" She leaned on the podium. "I didn't betray Blackridge. I stopped letting Blackridge use me. There's a difference. And if you can't see that difference, you're not ready to work in intelligence." "But you helped a foreign power." "I helped myself survive," Lillian interrupted. "Valdoria was simply the tool I used to do it. If Blackridge had valued me, protected me, acknowledged my contributions, I'd have stayed. But they didn't. So I made a different choice." Another student, a young woman in the back, spoke up. "Do you regret it, any of it?" Lillian considered the question seriously. "I regret that it was necessary. I regret that I had to run, that I couldn't simply demand better treatment and receive it. But I don't regret surviving. I don't regret building a life where my work is acknowledged and valued, and I definitely don't regret refusing to be erased." The questions continued for another hour, some hostile, some genuinely curious, some clearly from students who saw themselves in her story. Lillian answered all of them with the same direct honesty. She wasn't here to make them like her. She was here to make them think. When the lecture ended, Dean Matthias approached with several faculty members. They had questions of their own, technical ones about cipher implementation. theoretical ones about strategic frameworks. Lillian spent another 2 hours in discussion, energized in a way she hadn't expected. This was what she'd missed about the academy: the pure intellectual engagement, the chance to debate theory without political considerations. As she was leaving, a young woman caught up with her in the corridor. She was maybe 19, with ink-stained fingers and the intense look of someone who stayed up too late reading theory texts. "Minister Voss, I just wanted to say thank you." "For what?" Lillian asked. "For showing it's possible. I'm the only woman in my strategic theory cohort. Most days the professors act like I'm decorative furniture. But you prove that being overlooked is temporary if you're good enough." The girl paused. "Did you ever doubt yourself? When you were doing all that work in secret, did you ever think maybe they were right? Maybe you weren't actually capable?" Lillian looked at her and saw herself at 17, brilliant, overlooked, desperate to prove she mattered. "Every day," she said honestly. "For 5 years I doubted whether I was actually good at this or just fooling myself. But I kept doing the work anyway, and eventually the work proved itself. That's the secret. You don't need confidence, you just need competence and stubbornness." The girl smiled. "I can do stubborn." "Then you'll be fine." Lillian returned to Valdor feeling lighter than she had in months. The lecture had been cathartic in ways she hadn't anticipated. Not because she'd won over the skeptics. Some students had left still thinking she was a traitor, and that was fine. But because she'd stood in that hall, in the academy that had educated her, and spoken about her work under her own name. No hiding, no proxies, no letting someone else take credit. Just her expertise, and the proof that she'd been right all along. 2 years into her tenure as minister, Lillian received word that Rowan had died. He'd been living in exile in a minor coastal city, drinking heavily and telling anyone who would listen that he'd been betrayed by a conniving wife. He'd fallen down a flight of stairs one night, drunk and alone, and broken his neck. The news reached her in a diplomatic pouch, a brief note from Garrett. "Thought you should know. The Duke is dead. Natural causes, if you count chronic stupidity and alcoholism as natural." G. Lillian read it, felt nothing, and went back to work. That evening, Vale found her in her office, still working through reports. "I heard about Hale," he said. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Lillian said, and she was. There was no grief, no regret, not even satisfaction. Rowan's death changed nothing. He'd been irrelevant for years already. "You don't need to talk about it?" "There's nothing to talk about." Lillian set down her pen. "He was a man who mistook charm for competence and paid the price. I stopped caring about him the moment I crossed that river. His death is just confirmation that I made the right choice in leaving." Vale studied her for a moment. "You know what's frightening about you?" "What?" "How completely you can cut someone out of your life once you've decided they don't matter. It's like they cease to exist for you." "Is that a criticism?" Lillian asked. "No, just an observation. A slightly terrifying observation, but an accurate one." After he left, Lillian sat alone thinking about what he'd said. Was it frightening, the way she could dismiss people who'd once been central to her life? Maybe. But it was also necessary. She couldn't have survived if she'd stayed emotionally attached to the people who'd tried to destroy her. Cutting them out. Rowan, Isadora, even Blackridge itself, had been survival instinct, not cruelty. She'd learned to protect herself by refusing to care about those who didn't care about her. It was a harsh lesson, but an effective one. 3 years into her position, the Valdorian Council faced a succession crisis. High Minister Katerin announced her retirement, citing age and a desire to spend her remaining years writing instead of governing. The council would need a new leader, someone with experience, diplomatic skill, and the respect of both the military and civilian ministers. The vote was scheduled for a month out. In the meantime, the council members circled each other like sharks, forming alliances, making promises, positioning themselves for power. Lillian stayed out of it. She had her work, her intelligence operations, and no desire to spend her days managing council politics. Let someone else have the headaches of leadership. But apparently, the council had other ideas. Minister Chen approached her a week before the vote. "We need to talk about the succession." "You need to talk about it," Lillian corrected. "I'm staying out of the whole thing." "That's the problem. You're the compromise candidate." Lillian set down the intercept she'd been reading. "I'm what?" "The compromise candidate. Gregor's faction and Orlov's faction both have candidates, but neither can get enough votes to win. You're the one person everyone respects enough to accept. Chen sat down across from her. We've been discussing it. If you put your name forward, you'd win. I don't want to be High Minister, Lillian said immediately. Why not? You're already doing half the job anyway. You coordinate intelligence, manage diplomatic relations, run strategic planning. Adding the administrative work wouldn't be that different. It would be completely different. High Minister is about politics, not strategy. I'd spend my days managing personalities and negotiating compromises instead of doing actual work. You'd also have the power to reshape how this empire operates, Chen pointed out, to implement the systems you've been designing, to move resources where they're actually needed, to build something that lasts beyond any individual minister's tenure. Lillian opened her mouth to refuse again, then stopped. Chen had a point. As Foreign Intelligence Minister, she could influence policy. As High Minister, she could set it. She could build the kind of institutional architecture that would make the empire stronger, more efficient, more resilient. She could create systems that didn't depend on any single person being brilliant or dedicated, systems that would keep working even after she was gone. Let me think about it, Lillian said finally. She spent 3 days thinking. Weighing the costs against the benefits, the loss of focused intelligence work against the gain of broader institutional power. She talked to Vale, who thought she should do it. She talked to Katerin, who said the choice had to be hers, but that she'd make an excellent High Minister. She even talked to Petrov, who said, if you don't take it, we'll end up with someone who cares more about glory than governance. Please don't do that to us. In the end, what decided her was a conversation with the young woman from the Athenaeum. The girl had written her several letters over the past 2 years, updating her on progress, asking occasional questions. Her latest letter mentioned that she'd been accepted into Valdoria's intelligence training program and hoped to work under Minister Voss someday. You showed me it's possible to be taken seriously even when everyone assumes your decoration. I want to do the same for the next generation. Lillian read that and made her decision. She put her name forward the next day. The vote wasn't even close. 6 ministers voted for her immediately. The 7th, Minister Orlov, who'd never fully trusted her, abstained but didn't oppose. Within hours, Lillian Voss, former Duchess of Blackridge, defector and traitor, was officially appointed High Minister of the Valdorian Empire. The ceremony was smaller than she'd expected. Katerin handed over the official seal, gave a brief speech about trusting Lillian to lead with wisdom and strength, and then it was done. Lillian stood in front of the assembled council, holding a symbol of authority she'd never imagined possessing. Thank you for your confidence, she said. I'll try not to make you regret it. If you do, Gregor said, we'll vote you out again. That's how this works. Fair enough, Lillian said, and meant it. Her first year as High Minister was brutal. The administrative work was every bit as tedious as she'd feared, managing budgets, mediating disputes between ministers, dealing with petty political squabbles that had nothing to do with actual governance. She hated it. But she was also reshaping the empire in ways that mattered. She reorganized the intelligence services, making them more efficient and less vulnerable to individual corruption. She implemented new training programs for diplomatic corps. She restructured trade agreements to favor long-term stability over short-term profit. And most importantly, she began documenting everything. Every system she built, every process she designed, every strategic framework she used. She wrote it all down in detailed manuals that future ministers could reference. She was building institutional knowledge that would outlast her. You're trying to make yourself obsolete, Vale observed one evening, finding her in her office writing another training manual at midnight. I'm trying to make the empire not dependent on any single person being exceptional, Lillian corrected, including me. That's how you build something that lasts. In her 3rd year as High Minister, Lillian received an invitation that made her laugh out loud. It was from Blackridge, from the Marcher Council, requesting her presence at a ceremony honoring those who served the duchy with distinction during the war years. The letter was carefully worded, acknowledging her contributions without explicitly admitting they'd been wrong to overlook her. It was the political equivalent of an apology from people too proud to actually apologize. Are you going? Katerin asked. The former High Minister had become a friend in retirement, stopping by occasionally to offer advice or just talk. I don't know. Part of me wants to tell them to hang themselves, but another part, Lillian trailed off. Another part wants closure, Katerin finished. The chance to stand in that hall, receive acknowledgement, and prove you didn't need their validation to succeed. Is that petty? Lillian asked. Probably, but you've earned a little pettiness. Katerin smiled. Go, accept their ceremony. Let them honor you. Not because you need it, but because making them acknowledge what they tried to ignore is its own kind of victory. Lillian went. The ceremony was held in Blackridge's Great Hall, the same room where she'd attended countless banquets while being systematically overlooked. Now she entered as High Minister of Valdoria, accompanied by a full diplomatic delegation, and the room rose to greet her. Lord Garrett, now officially Duke Garrett after a formal vote by the Marcher Council, presided over the ceremony. He looked older, grayer, but more content than he'd been under Rowan's rule. We gather today, Garrett said, to honor those whose service during the war years has only recently been fully understood and appreciated. Lady Lillian Voss, though now High Minister of Valdoria, spent 5 years as the unacknowledged architect of Blackridge's military strategy. Her intelligence work, cryptographic systems, and strategic planning were instrumental in our victories. That these contributions were not recognized at the time is a failure we acknowledge and seek to remedy today. He presented her with a formal commendation, a document bearing the seals of all the Marcher Lords, acknowledging her role in preserving and defending the duchy through strategic excellence and unwavering dedication. Lillian accepted it with a slight smile. Thank you, Duke Garrett, though I should note that unwavering dedication would have required me to actually want to be here. I was mostly just trying to keep busy. The room laughed, uncertain if she was joking. She wasn't, really, but let them interpret it however they wanted. After the ceremony, Garrett pulled her aside. That was gracious of you, accepting this, coming here. It would have been easy to refuse. It would have been easier, Lillian agreed, but this isn't about easy. It's about making sure history records what actually happened. 20 years from now, someone will read that commendation and know that the victories attributed to Duke Rowan Hale were actually the work of an overlooked woman who had to flee for her life before anyone would acknowledge her value. Is that why you came? For the historical record? Partly. Also because I wanted to stand in this hall one more time and know I'd never have to come back unless I chose to. Lillian looked around the great hall. This place tried to make me small. It failed. I wanted to make sure it knew that. She returned to Valdor the next day and never looked back. 5 years into her tenure as High Minister, Lillian stood at her office window watching spring rain wash over the city and thought about how far she'd come. From an overlooked duchess to a foreign minister to the leader of an empire. From invisible to undeniable. From someone whose greatest achievement was staying quiet to someone whose voice shaped policy for 3 kingdoms. It still didn't feel real sometimes. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Vale entered carrying a folder. The intelligence report you requested on the Northern Alliance. Also, there's someone here to see you. Who? A young woman. Says she's studying strategic theory at the Athenaeum. Apparently you spoke at her graduation. Lillian remembered. The girl from the lecture. The one with ink-stained fingers and fierce determination. Send her in. The young woman entered nervously, clearly awed by being in the High Minister's office. She was older now, mid-20s, with the bearing of someone who'd learned confidence through hard work. Minister. High Minister Voss, thank you for seeing me. Of course, what can I do for you? I'm applying for a position in the Diplomatic Intelligence Service. I've completed all the qualifications, passed the examinations, but I wanted... She hesitated. I wanted to ask your advice about how to succeed in a field that still doesn't expect women to excel. Lillian gestured for her to sit. The same way anyone succeeds. Be better than your competition, document your work so no one can steal credit, and refuse to make yourself small for anyone's comfort. That sounds lonely, the young woman said quietly. It can be, Lillian admitted, but loneliness is better than invisibility. Trust me on that. They talked for an hour. About strategy, about navigating male-dominated fields, about the importance of building systems that couldn't be easily dismantled. When the young woman left, she looked more confident, more ready to fight the battles Lillian knew were coming. After she was gone, Vale returned. Making protégés now? Someone has to, Lillian said. The systems I'm building won't maintain themselves. They need people who understand why they matter, who will fight to keep them functional. You're thinking about legacy. I'm thinking about what happens after I'm gone. Whether the changes I've made will last, or whether they'll just evaporate the moment someone less committed takes over. Lillian returned to her desk. I don't want to be remembered as an exception. I want to be remembered as the person who made exceptions normal. 10 years after fleeing Blackridge on a half-dead horse, Lillian Voss stood before the full Council of Ministers and announced her retirement. I've served as High Minister for 7 years, she said. In that time, we've reorganized intelligence services, strengthened diplomatic relations with 4 kingdoms, and built institutional systems that should outlast any individual administrator. I'm proud of that work. But I'm also 52 years old and tired of spending my days managing bureaucracy instead of doing the strategic work I actually enjoy. The council tried to talk her out of it, of course. Catherine had been right. Once you proved you were good at something, people became very reluctant to let you stop doing it. But Lillian held firm. She'd built what she'd set out to build. Time to let someone else carry it forward. She recommended her successor, Minister Chen, who had the diplomatic skill and institutional knowledge to maintain what Lillian had created. The council agreed, and the transition was smooth, professional, and surprisingly emotional. On her last day, Lillian cleaned out her office and found herself holding the letter from the Marcher Council, the one acknowledging her contributions to Blackridge. She'd kept it all these years, not because she needed the validation, but because it represented something important, proof that she'd been right to leave, right to rebuild, right to refuse to accept being erased. She tucked it into her bag and walked out of the High Minister's office for the last time. Retirement suited her better than she'd expected. Lillian took a position at Valdor's Strategic Academy, teaching advanced cryptography and intelligence theory to students who actually wanted to learn. She wrote extensively, publishing papers on strategic frameworks and institutional design that became required reading in 4 kingdoms. She consulted occasionally with the government on specific intelligence matters, but only when it interested her. And slowly she built a life that wasn't defined by survival or revenge or the need to prove anything to anyone. She was simply herself. Lillian Voss, strategic theorist, former High Minister, teacher, writer. A woman who'd been overlooked, underestimated, and nearly destroyed, but who'd turned that experience into expertise that reshaped how empires thought about intelligence and institutional power. Years later, teaching an advanced theory class, a student asked her the same question she'd been asked at her first lecture. Do you regret any of it? Leaving Blackridge, betraying your husband, building a life in a foreign empire? Lillian thought about it, really thought, considering the question seriously. I regret that I had to, she said finally. I regret that asking to be valued, asking to be acknowledged, asking not to be locked away for being inconvenient, those things were too much to ask in the place where I started. But I don't regret surviving. I don't regret refusing to be erased. And I definitely don't regret building something that outlasted the people who tried to destroy me. She paused, looking at the young faces watching her. Some women, some men, all of them learning that strategic brilliance had nothing to do with who was allowed to have it, and everything to do with who was willing to develop it. The world tried to make me invisible, Lillian continued. For a while, I let it. But eventually, I realized that invisibility was only permanent if I accepted it, so I didn't. I took everything I'd learned while being overlooked, and I used it to build something they couldn't ignore. That's not revenge. That's just refusing to disappear. The student nodded, taking notes, and Lillian smiled. She'd spent 5 years being the invisible architect behind someone else's glory. Then she'd spent 20 years building her own glory, piece by documented piece, creating systems and knowledge that would outlast her. She'd started as nothing, an overlooked duchess with no power and no voice. She'd become everything, a high minister, a teacher, a woman whose name appeared in history books and strategic theory texts. And somewhere between nothing and everything, she'd discovered something more important than either. She'd become herself. Fully, completely, unapologetically herself. That, Lillian thought, was worth more than all the titles and acknowledgments in the world. She'd been invisible once. She'd been overlooked, dismissed, nearly erased. But she'd walked away, and she'd taken everything that mattered with her. In the end, that was all the victory she'd ever needed.